The cliff didn't care that I was a duke's son. It just sat there. Gray rock, salt wind, a 200-foot drop to black water, and waited to see what I would do next. Behind me, 12 men stood in a loose formation that had stopped resembling military order 3 days ago. Their uniforms were still technically correct, buttons on the right holes, boots laced, but their faces had that particular hollowness that comes not from one missed meal but from many, the kind that makes a man's eyes look like they're focusing on something slightly behind whatever he's looking at. The Imperial escort had left us at the provincial border marker. 4 soldiers, 1 clerk. The clerk read the summary aloud in the flat voice of a man who reads sentences like this regularly and has learned not to think about them. The document was 3 paragraphs of formality and 1 honest phrase. The formality covered my crimes, my sentence, my restrictions. It also listed my supply allocation, Category D rations, monthly, for a garrison of 13. I had been a logistics officer for 4 years. I knew Category D. 13 men, standard spoilage rate, no resupply route mapped on this coast. That was 9 days of food, stretched to 11 if I lied to them about portion sizes. I was not going to lie to them about portion sizes. Pending availability. That was the honest phrase. 2 words at the end of the 3rd paragraph, stamped and signed and completely clear to anyone who had spent 4 years watching Famine Coast run the Western Supply Division. Pending availability meant the monthly allocation was never coming. It meant the 9 days were not a starting point. They were the whole plan. The clerk didn't look at any of us when he finished reading. You don't make eye contact with men who aren't going to matter. Then they turned and rode back east. 9 days. 13 mouths. I had done the math before the clerk finished the sentence. The question was what I was going to do with it. I turned back to the ocean. The Famine Coast stretched north and south as far as I could see, a ragged line of pale cliffs, black rocks and gray water. No harbor visible from here, no smoke from any settlement. Just wind and the distant sound of waves breaking against stone 200 feet below. Sergeant Roven was the only one still standing straight. 22 years in the Imperial Army, fought in the northern campaigns, the river wars, the border pacification, survived all of it. And now he was standing on a cliff in the Famine Coast, trying not to let his legs shake in front of the men he'd spent 2 decades commanding. I respected that. I had known Famine Coast for 4 years, long enough to understand exactly how he worked. He was not a dramatic man. He didn't hate me the way a rival hates, with heat and obsession. He simply found me inconvenient, and inconvenient things in Harvin's world were redirected until they stopped being inconvenient. I had been redirected here. The supplies would be redirected somewhere else. Clean, efficient, and completely deniable. Pending availability was Harvin's handwriting, even if the clerk's voice had delivered it. The compass shifted in my coat pocket. I didn't take it out, not yet. My grandfather had carried it through the siege of Aldenmore 30 years ago. A brass compass, heavier than it looked, with a needle that moved slightly slower than it should, and a crack along the outer casing that had been there as long as I could remember. He'd given it to me the year before he died, when I was 14 and thought I understood things I didn't. He'd said, "This compass doesn't point north, Kael. It points at the right decision, but only after you've already found it yourself." I'd thought he was being poetic. He wasn't. I'd learned what it actually did 3 years ago during the grain shipment disaster that had ended my career and my name in the same week. I'd been trying to decide whether to reroute a failing supply convoy through the southern passes or push through the flooded northern road. The needle had spun and locked when I'd finally worked out, after 6 hours of calculations and 3 discarded plans, that the southern passes were the only option. 12 hours later, the northern road had collapsed completely. The convoy had made it through the south. It hadn't saved me. My brother Dorian had made sure of that. But it had confirmed something I needed to know about the compass. Rule 1, it confirmed correct decisions. It didn't suggest them. Rule 2, it only confirmed once per major choice. If I acted on a wrong sub-decision before the main confirmation arrived, it went cold. 7 days of silence, 7 days of navigating blind. Rule 3, I had to actually figure out the answer first. The compass was not a shortcut. It was a receipt. 9 days of rations, 13 mouths. I needed to figure out the answer fast. I pulled the compass out and looked at it. The needle sat still. Good. I hadn't earned it yet. I turned to Roven. "How much food do we have between all of us?" Roven didn't hesitate. He never hesitated on logistics. It was the one thing I'd confirmed about him in 3 days of travel. He ran head counts and supply checks the way other men breathed. Automatically, without thinking, because stopping meant something had gone wrong. 3 days, maybe 4 if we're careful. I have 2 men who haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Names? Perrin and Goss. Which ones? He pointed. 2 young soldiers near the back, barely 20, both of them. Perrin was leaning on his spear in a way that looked casual but wasn't. Goss had his eyes closed. I walked to them. Perrin. He opened his eyes. Sharp, despite everything. Good. Sir. When did you last eat? Yesterday at dawn, sir, half a biscuit. And before that? A pause. Day before, same. I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached into my pack, took out one of my own rations, a dense block of dried meat and grain that tasted like salted wood, and handed it to him. Eat it slowly. I repeated it with Goss. By the time I straightened up, every other soldier was watching me. I had just given away my dinner and tomorrow's breakfast. Not because it was noble, because 12 men who have watched their commanding officer eat last will work harder than 12 men who are waiting to see if he'll take the largest share. I had learned this from the logistics side, from counting what got used and what didn't, from tracking which units overperformed their supply allocation and which ones wasted half of it. The answer was almost always the same. It came down to whether the men trusted the person making the decisions. I didn't have much to offer these men, but I could offer that. Roven, I said, we're not staying on this cliff. Obviously, he said, not disrespectfully, just practically. There was a settlement on the Famine Coast. Old fishing community. The coastal survey maps, the ones I filed 3 years ago that nobody read, showed a harbor master's station approximately 4 miles north. Stone construction. It may still be standing. May, I agreed. The alternative is this cliff, so we walk. We walked. 4 miles on the Famine Coast is not 4 miles anywhere else. The path along the cliff edge was barely a path, more of a suggestion that previous humans had once moved in this direction. The wind came in from the ocean in long, steady pushes that made you lean into it automatically, like fighting something that had no interest in fighting back. The rocks underfoot were the color of old ash and just as stable. Twice in the first mile, someone slipped. Neither time did they fall. I kept my eyes on the terrain and my mind on the survey. I had spent 2 weeks on the Famine Coast 3 years ago, as a junior logistics officer tasked with assessing its potential as an emergency supply zone. My report had been thorough. I had documented the old fishing villages, the salt flats along the northern shelf, the rock formations that created natural windbreaks, the species of fish visible from the cliff edge at dawn, the freshwater stream that came down from the inland hills approximately 6 miles north of the harbor master's station. The report had been filed, stamped, archived, and completely ignored, which meant every piece of information in it was still accurate and completely unknown to anyone who might use it against me. This was the only advantage I had. It was enough to start with. We found the harbor master's station as the sun was dropping toward the waterline. Abandoned for at least a decade, the door had warped in its frame from salt air, 2 windows had lost their shutters, and something had made a nest in one corner of the main room that smelled strongly of fish, and something else I chose not to investigate. But the walls were stone, and the roof was intact. That was what mattered. Make camp, I told Roven. 2 fires, one inside, one sheltered on the east wall. I need 30 minutes. For what? Record crates in the back room. Old harbor master's logs. I want to see what's in them. Roven looked at me the way experienced soldiers look at officers who say things that sound strange, but who haven't been wrong yet. He went to organize the fires. I went to the back room. The crates were stacked 4 high along the back wall, warped from moisture but sealed. The top 2 were useless. Water damage had turned the pages into solid gray blocks. But the bottom 2 had been better protected by the weight above them, and the records inside were readable. 12 years of harbor master logs. Catch records, tide tables, tax assessments, supply delivery confirmations, or rather, confirmations of when the supply deliveries hadn't come, recorded with the patient regularity of a man who had long since stopped expecting anyone to do anything about it. But that wasn't what made me stop. What made me stop was a single ledger, thinner than the others, wedged behind the crates rather than inside them. It wasn't a harbor master's log. It was a supply allocation ledger, Imperial Western Supply Division, stamped with the Commissioner's Office seal, Harvin's seal. It covered 4 years of supply records for the Famine Coast Administrative Zone, and the numbers in it did not match the numbers in the official delivery logs I had seen during my time in the Logistics Division. The official logs said Category C rations had been delivered to the coast every season for 4 years. This ledger said Category C rations had been authorized, then systematically downgraded to Category D, then listed as delivered pending confirmation, then quietly rolled into the following season's allocation, which was then also downgraded, also listed as pending, and also never arrived. 4 years, every season, the same pattern. Harvin hadn't just been neglecting the Famine Coast. He had been stealing from it deliberately, methodically, and with enough paperwork to make it look like bureaucratic delay rather than theft. I sat back on my heels and looked at the ledger for a long moment. I put it inside my coat, against my chest, and buttoned my coat over it. Then I went back to the main room. Rovin had both fires going and had organized the men into watches with the efficiency of someone who has been doing this so long it has become a kind of architecture. Each man placed exactly where he would be most useful, watches staggered so fatigue never concentrated in the same place. "Anything useful?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "Tomorrow I need to find the boats." "What boats?" "Old fishing boats. The village had a lower harbor, rock cut, protected from the main swell. The survey showed 6 boats still moored there, though that was 3 years ago." End quote. I paused. "Some of them may still be seaworthy." Rovin did the arithmetic visibly. "You want to fish. I want to eat. Fishing is the method. None of my men are fishermen." "I know." I sat down near the fire. "I'll teach them what I know." Which isn't much. But the fish in this stretch of coast are deep water species that come close to the surface at dawn. I documented it in the survey. They're not clever. You drop a weighted line and they bite. Even soldiers can manage that. Brick, a heavy-set soldier who had said nothing since the cliff but had quietly fixed every loose strap and buckle on every pack around him during the walk without being asked, looked up from his bedroll. "That's almost a compliment." It was. A thin, dark-haired soldier named Colt raised his hand slightly. "Sir, what's the actual plan? Not just tomorrow. The actual plan." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was doing what Famine Coast wind did, pushing steadily, without urgency, as though it had been doing this for 10,000 years and had no intention of stopping. "The actual plan," I said, "is that we don't die." "That's not a plan, that's a goal." "Fair." I looked at him. "The plan is, we produce something. Food first. Fish, salt preserved. Then enough that we have surplus. Then we use surplus as currency. Not gold. Not status, surplus. The coast has fish, salt flats, and a natural harbor. 3 years ago, those were observations in a report nobody read. Now they're the difference between us and 9 days, so I intend to use them." And silence. Then Rovin. "And if the Imperial supplies come through?" "They won't." "How do you know?" I looked at the fire. "Because the man who controls them has been stealing from this coast for 4 years. He didn't send us here to survive. He sent us here to quietly disappear. So there's one less loose thread in his ledger." More silence. Longer this time. "Then why are we still following orders?" Colt asked. I reached into my coat and pulled out the compass. Let them see it. "Because I'm not following his orders," I said. "I'm following mine. And because when I'm done, the thread he tried to cut is going to pull the whole ledger apart." Unquote. The needle sat still in the compass face. I hadn't earned the confirmation yet, but I was close. I closed the compass and put it back. "Sleep," I told them. "Dawn starts early here." The boats were there. All 6 of them, moored in the rock-cut harbor at the base of the cliff, reached by a path so narrow we had to go single file with our backs against the stone. The harbor itself was a natural feature, a deep indentation in the cliff base, protected on 3 sides, with a flat rock shelf where the harbor master had once supervised the unloading of daily catches. The boats were in varying states of existence. 2 were beyond saving, hulls staved in, waterlogged to the point of being geological features rather than vessels. A third had lost its mast, and 2 of its 3 bench planks. A fourth was missing its rudder pin entirely, which I could work around with a carved replacement, but not quickly. But the 5th and 6th, old, salt-battered, smelling of years of disuse, were structurally intact. I spent 2 hours going over them with the thoroughness of a man whose life depended on being right about wood. I pressed knuckles against planking and listened to the sound it made. I checked the caulking seams, the thole pins, the condition of the rope coils left in the bows. I turned over every piece of gear still aboard. The 6th boat had a net. Old, repaired in multiple places. Some of the mesh rotted through. But a net. "Marin," I said. Marin was 26, compact, with the careful hands of someone who'd grown up fixing things. I'd noticed this on the walk. She'd resecured a loose pack strap on the soldier ahead of her, using only a strip of leather and a flat rock for a pin, without breaking stride, without mentioning it. "Can you fix a net?" She looked at it. "Depends what I have to fix it with." "Whatever's in the harbor master's storeroom. Rope coils, canvas." Show me the damage first. I spread the net on the rock shelf. 3 sections of mesh rotted through, each about the size of 2 hands side by side. The rest was sound. That I can fix, she said. Give me 2 hours and something to eat. 1 hour, I said. The fish rise at dawn. We have 40 minutes. She looked at me steadily. 1 hour, she said. And something to eat. Deal. We put both boats in the water 40 minutes after dawn. 6 of us on the water. Rovan stayed on shore with the other 6, monitoring the cliff path. Marin handled the net from the stern of my boat. Colt rowed. Perrin, recovered enough from yesterday to be useful, sat in the bow watching the water the way I'd told him to, not at the surface, 2 feet below. What am I looking for? He'd asked. Shadows, moving against the current, not with it. That's a school. He spotted the first one 11 minutes out. There. East-southeast. 30 feet. Marin had the net over the side in under a minute. We let it drift. The current took it south and down. I watched the rope going over the side, counting depth by the knots I'd tied at 2-foot intervals. The rope went taut. Not the gradual tightening of a net filling with fish. The immediate, hard resistance of a net caught on something underwater. Back row, I said. Colt reverse stroke. The rope eased, then tightened again. Then the net came up. 11 fish. Not enormous, not the kind you'd write songs about. Solid, silver-scaled, flopping on the floor of the boat with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of creatures that had no idea they'd just become the most important things on the Famine Coast. Perrin stared at them. Then he looked at me. Then he started laughing. Not because it was funny, because 11 fish, after 3 days of shrinking rations and yesterday's half-biscuit and the cold and the cliff and the walk and all of it, 11 fish was the funniest and best thing he'd ever seen in his life. I let him laugh. I was doing the math. 11 fish from 1 net pull. 2 boats, 4 pulls per boat before the dawn feeding ended. 90 minutes, per the survey. Second boat pulling similar numbers, if Dex holding a fish above his head with both hands and shouting something I couldn't hear across the water meant what I thought it meant. Rough calculation, 60 to 80 fish per morning. 3 ounces of cleaned meat per fish on the smaller ones, 5 on the larger. 13 mouths needed 8 ounces each per day to stay functional. Not comfortable, but functional. At 60 fish, we were at surplus by day 3. At 80 fish, we were feeding 18 people. We didn't have 18 people yet. The compass vibrated in my coat pocket before I reached for it. I took it out. The needle spun once, slow, deliberate, the way it always moved, like it had nowhere urgent to be and wanted me to pay attention. It locked north-northeast, toward the salt flats, 6 miles up the coast. I stared at it for a moment. The fish kept us alive for 9 days. Salt kept the fish for 9 months. And 9 months was enough time to build something that couldn't be quietly redirected away. I put the compass back. Marin, I said, when we get back to shore, I need you to check the old salt pans, north end of the lower shelf, where the tide pools cut into the flat rock. Natural evaporation system, the harbor master used it before the operation collapsed. I need to know if it's still functional. She looked up from coiling the net. You're already thinking past the fish. The fish keeps us alive for a week, I said. The salt keeps us alive for a year. And after a year? I looked back at the water. At Dex in the other boat, still grinning. At Perrin, who had stopped laughing and was now quietly stacking each fish in the bow like they were something worth protecting. They sent me here to disappear. I was going to send them fish instead. After a year, I said, we make sure the right people find out we're still here. The salt pans were intact. Not functional, not yet. 3 years of neglect had left the channels between the evaporation pools clogged with wind-blown grit, and the low stone walls that directed the tidal flow partially collapsed in 2 places. But the underlying structure was sound. The flat rock shelf was still there. The tide pools still cut in from the north exactly where the survey had shown them, and the basic engineering, channels to direct incoming tide water into shallow pools, walls to trap it, sun and wind to do the rest, was simple enough that collapsed walls were a repair problem, not a rebuild problem. Marin spent 40 minutes walking the full length of the shelf before she came back to where I was standing. 2 days, she said. Maybe 3. I need 6 people and the right materials. What materials? Flat stones for the wall sections. Mortar if we have it, packed clay if we don't, and something to clear the channels. Shovels, or failing that, our hands. We don't have shovels. Then our hands. I looked at the shelf. 60 meters of evaporation pools, currently producing nothing. In 2 days, producing salt. Not commercial quantities, not yet. But enough to start preservation, enough to make the fish last. You'll have 6 people starting tomorrow morning, I said, after the boats come in. She nodded and walked back toward the pools, already calculating something I hadn't asked her to calculate yet. I watched her go and made a note in the back of my survey copy, the one I'd kept in my pack for 3 years because I hadn't been able to bring myself to leave it behind when they'd stripped my rank. Salt pan repair, day 2. Marin leading, est, operational, day 4-5. The math was changing. Day 1. 11 fish from a single pull, roughly 60 estimated across both boats, and 4 pulls, enough to feed 13 men for 2 days if we were careful, and ate the smaller ones fresh, preserved nothing. But I wasn't going to eat the smaller ones fresh and preserve nothing. I was going to eat the minimum required to stay functional and preserve everything else. Because the moment the salt pans were operational, every fish beyond immediate need became inventory. And inventory was the only form of power available to a man with no rank, no title, no allies, and 9 days of rations on a coast that the Empire had formally decided did not matter. I walked back to the harbor. Rovan had organized the morning catch by the time I returned. 63 fish total, close to my estimate, laid out on the flat rock shelf in rows, cleaned and gutted by Brick and a quiet soldier named Wes, who had said almost nothing since the cliff, but worked with the focused speed of someone who had done worse jobs and was grateful for the comparison. The heads and offal were already in a pile to one side. The heads, I said. Rovan looked at me. Don't discard them. Boil them tonight. The stock will stretch the rations. Fish head soup, fish head stock, there's a difference. There isn't. The difference, I said, is that stock sounds like something you made on purpose. Brick, who was still cleaning fish without looking up, made a sound that might have been a laugh. I crouched by the catch and counted. 63 fish. Average weight on the ones I lifted, roughly half a pound each before cleaning, a third after. 21 pounds of fish. 13 men needed 8 ounces each per day. That was 6.5 pounds per day consumed, leaving 14.5 pounds for preservation on day 1 alone, once I fed the men their full portion. Today I would feed them their full portion. Tomorrow I would feed them their full portion. By day 3 the salt pans would be producing. By day 4 I would start building stock. I stood up. Rovan. Rotation for tomorrow? I need 6 off the cliff watch for the salt pans. Marin will direct. The other 6 stay on boat duty. I want 4 pulls minimum per boat, same as today. That leaves no one on perimeter. What perimeter? There's nothing on this coast. That we know of. He was right. I had been thinking in supply terms and not in security terms, which was exactly the kind of single-focus error that got people killed in situations like this. The coast looked empty. That didn't mean it was. 2 on perimeter, I said, rotating with the salt pan crew, every 4 hours. He nodded. The nod of a man who had been waiting for me to catch up to something he already knew. Also, he said, Goss? What about him? He's not recovering the way Perrin is. Perrin ate and bounced. Goss ate and slept, and woke up worse. He paused. I've seen that before. When men go past a certain point without food, eating doesn't always fix it immediately. Sometimes they get worse before they get better. I looked toward the station. Goss was sitting against the east wall in the thin morning sun, wrapped in his coat. Even from here I could see that he was holding himself in the careful, contracted way of someone whose body had started doing its own triage. Double his ration today, I said. Take it from mine. You already gave yours away yesterday. Then take it from the general allocation. 1 extra portion, 1 man, 1 day. The math still works. I looked at Rovan. What else? Colt asked me last night what we're doing here, not tactically. He meant, what are we actually doing? What's the point? What did you tell him? I told him to ask you. I looked at the fish, laid out in their rows on the flat rock. 63 of them, which 2 weeks ago I could not have produced, and which today existed entirely because I'd written a survey report that nobody had bothered to read. Tell him the point, I said, is that we're the only people on this coast who know what this coast is worth. And that's an advantage nobody gave us, and nobody can take away. Rovan considered this. He's going to ask what we do with that advantage. Tell him we're doing it, I said. Tell him to clean the fish. The salt pans started producing on the morning of day 5. Not the morning of day 4, as Marin had estimated. Because on day 3, when the repair crew had been 2 hours from finishing the final wall section, the tide had come in higher than expected and flooded the lower channel, collapsing one of the rebuilt sections and depositing a significant quantity of sand directly into the evaporation pools. Marin had looked at the damage for approximately 10 seconds. Then she had reorganized the crew, redirected 3 of them to clearing the sand, while the other 3 rebuilt the wall section again, this time setting the foundation stones 6 inches deeper. She hadn't asked me. She'd assessed, decided, and acted. I noted this. Marin was not a soldier who waited for instructions. She was a soldier who waited until she had enough information to form her own opinion, and then acted on that opinion, and her opinion was usually correct. This was more valuable than obedience and harder to find. When the pans finally started producing on day 5, the first thin crust of white salt crystallizing in the shallowest pool by mid-morning, she came to find me at the harbor. "It's working," she said. "How much yield?" "First harvest will be small, maybe 2 pounds from the top pool, but the lower pools take longer to cycle. Once they're going, the yield compounds. By day 8, I think we're looking at 8 to 10 pounds per day. 8 to 10 pounds of salt per day." I ran the numbers while she was still talking. Salt-to-fish preservation ratio for smoked fish was roughly 1 part salt to 4 parts fish by weight. At 8 pounds of salt per day and 20-plus pounds of daily fish surplus, I could preserve everything we caught above immediate consumption. Within 2 weeks, we would have a stockpile. Within a month, we would have a stockpile that someone might want to buy. "Good," I said. "Start building a drying rack. East side of the station, out of the main wind. Use the timber from the 3rd boat, the one with the missing planks. It's not going back in the water anyway." She looked at me. "You want to smoke them. Salt and smoke both. Salt draws the moisture, smoke seals the surface. Together they extend shelf life from weeks to months." The old harbor master's logs showed he was doing both. There's a smokehouse foundation on the eastern side of the station, partially collapsed. We don't need the full structure, just the fire pit and a frame for the racks. "How do you know all of this?" "The survey." "You surveyed a smokehouse." "I surveyed everything," I said. "It was a thorough report." "That nobody read." "That nobody read," I agreed. "Until now." On day 7, the refugees arrived. I had been expecting something, not refugees specifically, but something. A coast that looked dead for a decade and then started showing firelight and boat activity was going to attract attention eventually. The only question was, what kind? What came over the inland ridge on the morning of day 7 was not attention. It was 230 people. They came in a loose, exhausted column. Men, women, children, a few elderly carried on improvised stretchers made from coat sleeves and branches. No carts, no animals, whatever they'd owned before was either gone or had been eaten. They looked the way people look when they have been walking toward the only light they could see for long enough that arriving doesn't feel like relief yet. It just feels like stopping. Rovan came to find me at the smokehouse frame, where I was fitting the last of the cross poles with brick. "We have a situation," he said. I looked past him at the ridge. Counted. 200, maybe 230. Children at roughly a third of the total. Elderly at maybe 15. The rest were working age, though working age after whatever they'd been through was a relative term. "Where are they from?" I asked. I sent Colt to ask. "Inland farming settlement. 3 days east. Grain blight hit their stores 4 months ago. They've been on reduced rations since autumn. The village council voted to move when the last of their seed stock failed." "Move where?" "Here," Rovan said. Apparently someone's grandfather remembered the fishing station. I looked at the column. 230 people. 13 mouths had been my starting math. Add 230, and the number became 243. My current surplus, 7 days of preserved fish, salt pans producing 8 pounds daily, smokehouse frame 2 days from operational, was calibrated for 13. For 243, it was nothing. Rovan was watching me do the arithmetic. He'd been watching me do arithmetic for a week and had developed an accurate read of what the different expressions meant. "You're not going to turn them away," he said. It wasn't a question. "No, because you can't feed them." "Not yet," I said, "but I can put them to work, and 200 workers are worth more than 200 mouths." He looked at the column again. "They're not soldiers. Neither were we 10 days ago. We were 13 men with 9 days of rations on a cliff." I set down the crosspole I was holding. "And now we have a smokehouse." Rovan was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" he asked. "Every able body sorted by skill in the next 2 hours. Fishing experience first. I need more boats repaired, which means I need people who know wood and rope. Construction second. The smokehouse frame needs to be finished today, not tomorrow. Children old enough to work go to the salt pans. Light work, but they can clear channels and carry stones. The elderly who can't work get full rations from our current stock, no conditions. That'll burn through our surplus. For 3 days. After that, 200 extra workers will have rebuilt it and then some. I looked at him. This is the math, Rovan. More people is a problem for exactly 3 days. After 3 days, more people is an answer. He nodded slowly. One more thing, he said. The man leading them. Village elder, name's Tosker. He wants to speak with you. Send him over. Tosker was older than I expected. 70, at least, with the particular stillness of someone who has been making decisions for a long time and has learned that most urgency is manufactured. He walked with a carved stick, not because his legs were weak, but because the stick had become habitual. He looked at the smokehouse frame, at the salt pans visible on the northern shelf, at the 2 fishing boats just coming in off the morning's 4th pull. Then he looked at me. You built all this in 7 days, he said. We built all this in 7 days, I said. My men built it. How? I knew what was here, I said. I'd been here before, 3 years ago. I wrote it down. Nobody else read the report, so the knowledge was still mine. He was quiet for a moment, leaning on his stick and looking at the boats. My grandfather fished this coast, he said. He said the problem was never the fish. The fish were always here. The problem was that nobody could figure out how to get them to the people who needed them before they went bad. Salt and smoke, I said. He looked at me. That simple? The simple things are usually the ones that were always possible and just never happened, I said. Because the person who knew how wasn't in the right place, or nobody asked, or the report got filed and ignored. I paused. Your people are welcome here. I need workers and you need food. That's a transaction, not charity. He studied me for a long moment. You're not what I expected, he said. Duke's son, they said. Exiled. Duke's 3rd son. There's a difference. What's the difference? The first son gets the estate. The second son gets the military commission. The third son, I said, gets the logistics posting. Which means he spends 4 years learning exactly how supply chains work, and exactly where they break, and exactly who benefits when they do. End quote. I looked at the coast, the cliffs, the harbor, the salt pans, the smokehouse frame going up in the morning light. In this particular case, that turned out to be useful. Tosker made a sound that might have been approval, or might have been something else. What do you need from us? He asked. Everyone who's ever fished, built, repaired nets, worked salt, smoked meat, or carried stones. I need them working by this afternoon. Everyone else rests today and starts tomorrow. Children go to Marin at the salt pans. She'll direct them. You organize your people. I'll organize the work. He nodded once, turned to go. Tosker, I said. He stopped. The 3 days of rations, the surplus we're going to spend feeding your people before they're productive. Consider it a loan. When we're producing surplus, I'll take it back in labor, not food. Fair exchange. He looked at me over his shoulder. You already calculated it, he said, before you said yes. I calculate everything, I said. It's a habit. Good habit, he said, and walked back toward his people. I went back to the smokehouse frame. Brick handed me the crosspole without being asked. 200 people, he said. 230. Is that good or bad? I fitted the pole into the notch I'd cut for it and pressed it flush. It held. The frame was solid. Solid enough that the smoke would stay in and the fish would cure properly. And in 3 days we would have preserved stock sufficient for nearly 250 people. Not 13, because the math had changed and the math changing was the whole point. 3 days ago, I said, a man named Harvin Crest thought he'd sent 13 people here to quietly disappear. Brick waited. 243, I said, is harder to make disappear. The compass was still in my coat pocket. I hadn't taken it out since the salt pan confirmation on day 1. I didn't need it yet. The next major decision was still forming, still accumulating the considerations and calculations and observations that would eventually resolve into something the compass could confirm. But I could feel it building. The way pressure builds before something shifts. The smokehouse went operational on day 9, not because we finished it on day 8, as planned. We finished it on day 8. It went operational on day 9 because I spent day 8's evening doing something I hadn't told anyone I was going to do, which was sit inside the finished structure with the harbor master's old smoking logs and work out exactly why the previous operation had failed. It mattered. A smokehouse that fails halfway through a curing cycle doesn't give you half-cured fish. It gives you rotten fish that looks preserved, which is worse than nothing because you don't find out until someone gets sick. The logs showed the original harbor master, a man named Pelwick, based on the signature style, had run a successful operation for 6 years before it collapsed. The collapse wasn't gradual, it was sudden. One season everything was working. The next season, supply allocations were cut, then cut again. then reclassified as pending. Pelwick had kept filing records for 2 more years after the operation effectively ended. The same patient, regular documentation of deliveries that hadn't come, and then the logs simply stopped. I didn't know what had happened to Pelwick. I knew what had happened to his coast. The smoking method he'd used was a cold smoke technique. Lower temperature, longer duration, better for long-term preservation. The wood he'd used was driftwood from a specific stretch of northern beach, which burned slower and produced less bitter smoke than the cliff-edge timber. I noted this. We had been using cliff-edge timber for the test fires. I sent Wes north at first light on day 9 to collect driftwood and told him to bring back as much as he could carry and then go back for more. The first proper smoke cycle ran for 18 hours starting mid-morning of day 9. I checked it every 3 hours, not because I didn't trust the process, but because the process was new, and new processes fail in new ways, and I wanted to be the person who caught the failure before it became a loss. At hour 6, the temperature in the lower chamber was running slightly hot. I adjusted the vent. At hour 12, the wood was burning too fast. I had Wes swap to the slower-burning driftwood sections. At hour 18, I opened the chamber. The fish were perfect. Dark, firm, smelling of wood smoke and salt. I cut one open. The flesh was dense and dry all the way through. No soft center, no moisture pockets where bacteria could work. I tasted a piece. It was not delicious. It was functional. It would last 3 months in dry storage. Longer if we kept it cool. It was the most important thing I had eaten in 9 days. Marin appeared at my shoulder. She looked at the open fish, then at me. "Well," she said. "Tell Tosker we start full production tomorrow," I said. "I want every available person on rotation, fishing crews at dawn, salt pan crews through midday, smoking crews from afternoon through evening. Continuous cycle." She nodded, and turned to go. "Marin." She stopped. "The salt pan yield, you said 8 to 10 pounds per day once the lower pools cycled. Where are we actually?" She didn't hesitate. 11 pounds yesterday. The lower pools are producing better than I estimated. The rock formation on the southern end creates a secondary evaporation effect I didn't account for. If we extend the collection area another 10 meters north, I think we can get to 15 pounds of salt per day. At a 1-to-4 preservation ratio, that was 60 pounds of fish per day. We were currently catching 80 to 100 pounds per day across both boats, which meant I could preserve everything above immediate consumption and still have margin. "Extend it," I said. "Take whoever you need from Tosker's people." "Already asked him," she said. "He said yes before I finished the question." She left. I stood in the smokehouse with the open fish in my hand and did the forward calculation. Day 10. Full production cycle begins. Preservation rate, 60 pounds per day. Day 20, 600 pounds of preserved stock. Day 30, 1,200 pounds. 1,200 pounds of preserved smoked fish, salted and cured, was not a coast trying to survive. It was a coast with something to sell. The merchant caravan found us on day 19. 6 wagons, 12 guards, a factor named Silas who wore good boots and bad patience in equal measure. They came from the Western Trade Road, not the Imperial Highway, the old road that ran along the inland edge of the cliff country and connected the fishing settlements to the river markets. A road that, according to my survey, had seen almost no traffic since the Famine Coast operations had collapsed a decade ago. They were not looking for us. They were looking for a shortcut. Silas came to the station with 2 of his guards and the expression of a man who expects to find nothing useful and is mildly irritated that he has to check. He found 243 people, a functioning smokehouse, operational salt pans, 2 fishing boats completing their morning run, and me. He stopped in the middle of the station yard and looked at all of it for a long moment. "What is this?" he said. "A fishing operation," I said. "On the Famine Coast." "On the Famine Coast." He looked at the smokehouse, at the salt pans visible on the northern shelf, at the racks of curing fish along the east wall of the station, at Tosker's people moving through the yard in the organized rotation we'd established, fishing crews coming in, salt crews going out, smoking crews loading the chamber. "This wasn't here," he said. "It wasn't here 3 weeks ago," I agreed. "It's here now." He turned to look at me properly, taking in the coat, the lack of rank insignia, the fact that I was clearly directing an operation of this scale without any visible authority to do so. "Who are you?" he said. "The man running this coast," I said. "Who are you?" A pause. Then, despite himself, "Silas Marsh, factor for the Westmark Trading House. We move dried goods and preserved foods along the inland routes to the river markets." Preserved foods. "Then we should talk," I said. We talked for 2 hours. I showed him the smokehouse output, let him examine the fish, cut one open himself, the way I had on day 9, checking for the soft center that would mean it was no good. He found no soft center. He smelled it, pressed it, held it to the light. 3 months shelf life? He said. 3 to 4. Longer in cool storage. Salt content? Optimal for preservation. I have the ratios documented. I showed him the log I'd been keeping since day 9. Each batch, the wood used, the salt-to-fish ratio, the smoke duration, the result. Clean numbers, organized by day, verifiable. He looked at the log for a long time. Merchants, I had learned during my logistics years, trust documentation more than claims. Claims cost nothing. Documentation means someone cared enough about the numbers to write them down, which means the numbers are probably real. How much do you have available? He said. This was the moment I had been building toward. Not consciously. I hadn't known a merchant would arrive on day 19, but the preparation had been deliberate. The logs, the preserved stock, the organized operation that looked like something you could depend on, rather than something that might collapse next week. Currently, I said, 460 pounds of preserved stock. Production rate is 60 pounds per day and increasing as we expand the salt pan capacity. He did the arithmetic. I watched him do it. I can take 200 pounds, he said. Today. I'm not selling today, I said. He looked up from the log. I don't know you, I said. I don't know your trading house. I don't know your route or your payment practices, or whether you'll come back. I met his eyes. I will sell you 50 pounds today at a price I'll name on the condition that you return in 3 weeks with payment and a formal trading agreement. That's not how purchasing works. It's how I work, I said. You get 50 pounds at below market rate to demonstrate the product to your buyers. I get 3 weeks to verify that you're someone worth dealing with. If you come back with the agreement and the payment, I sell you as much as you can carry at fair rate going forward. If you don't come back, I've lost 50 pounds of stock and learned something useful. Silas looked at me. Below market rate, he said. 20% below standard dried fish pricing at the river markets, I said, which I know because I spent 4 years in Imperial Supply Logistics and I have the market tables memorized. Another pause. Longer. You're not just a fisherman, he said. No, I said. Then what are you? I thought about the clerk who hadn't looked at any of us when he finished reading. The 2 words at the end of the 3rd paragraph. The 9 days that were supposed to be the whole plan. I'm the man who runs this coast, I said. Same answer as before. Silas almost smiled. 50 pounds, he said. 20% below market. 3 weeks. Agreed. I extended my hand. I'll have it packed and loaded within the hour. He shook it. After he left with his wagons, Rovan materialized at my shoulder, the way he had developed a habit of doing when he wanted to ask something without appearing to ask it. We just sold fish to a merchant, he said. We did. For what? Nothing yet, I said. That's the point. If he comes back in 3 weeks with payment and an agreement, we have a trading partner and a route to the river markets. If he doesn't come back, we lost 50 pounds of stock. We lost 50 pounds of stock, and we know that the Western trade road isn't viable, which means I look east instead. I watched the last of Silas's wagons disappear over the ridge. Either way, the information was worth 50 pounds. Rovan was quiet for a moment. You think like a merchant. I think like a logistics officer, I said. Merchants think about profit. Logistics officers think about flow. Where things go, how fast, what stops them, what happens when the supply line breaks. Ein quote. I paused. Harvin Crest spent 6 years stopping the flow to this coast. I'm going to spend the next 3 weeks figuring out how to route around him entirely. The compass shifted in my coat pocket. I reached in and took it out without thinking. The needle spun. Slow, deliberate, the way it always moved. It locked, east-northeast. Not the salt flats this time. Not the harbor. East-northeast was inland. Toward the river road, toward the capital. Toward the places where the people who needed to know we existed hadn't yet found out. I stared at the compass for a long moment. Then I understood what it was confirming. Not the merchant. Not the trading agreement. The gift. I brought it up at the evening meal. All of us together, soldiers and Tosker's people mixed now in a way that had happened gradually and without announcement, the way most important things happen. Rovan and Marin and Tosker and Colt and Brick, sitting around the main fire in the station with fish stock and the first of the root vegetables Tosker's people had brought in a trader's pack 3 days ago. I want to send something to the capital, I said. Silence. Not a petition, I said. Not a request, not a complaint. I looked around the fire. A gift. 40 barrels of preserved fish, loaded onto the next available transport heading east. Addressed to the Imperial Provisioning Office. No conditions, no requests, no signature beyond the name of the coast. Colt set down his bowl. Why? Because right now, the only people who know this coast is producing anything are us, Silas Marsh, and whoever Silas talks to on the trade road. The Imperial record still shows this coast as a failed administrative zone, Category D pending availability, nothing producing, nothing expected, end quote. I looked at the fire. The moment 40 barrels of smoked fish arrive at the Imperial Provisioning Office from the Famine Coast, that record becomes wrong. And Imperial records that become wrong attract attention. What kind of attention? Tosker asked. The kind that asks questions, I said. How is the Famine Coast producing surplus? Who's running it? Why didn't we know? I paused. Some of that attention will be useful. Some of it will be Harvin Crest, trying to understand what's happening and how to stop it. And you want Harvin to know? Rovan said. I want Harvin to find out the way he finds out everything. Through official channels, after the fact, when the record already exists and can't be quietly amended. I met Rovan's eyes. He's a bureaucrat. He operates through paperwork. The moment this coast appears in official provisioning records as a producing zone, he has to respond through official channels. He can't just redirect us. We're on the record now. The fire crackled. Tosker was looking at me with the expression he'd had when he'd arrived, the careful assessment of a man who has been making decisions for 50 years and knows what a person who thinks in systems looks like. You're not just trying to survive, he said. I never was, I said. You're building a case. I thought about the ledger in my coat. 4 years of Harvin's skimmed allocations, recorded in his own seal. The harbor master's logs, documenting every missing delivery. The production records I'd been keeping since day one. Clean numbers, organized by day, the kind of documentation that a tribunal could follow. I'm building a record, I said. Harvin has a record too. His shows a bureaucratic delay. Mine shows what was actually happening on this coast while he was delaying. I looked around the fire. When those two records are compared side by side in front of someone with authority, one of them becomes evidence. Silence. Then Brick, who had been eating steadily throughout and had not looked up. 40 barrels. 40 barrels, I said. We have that? We will by morning, I said. I've been holding back production for 3 days for exactly this. Brick looked up. You planned this before the merchant arrived. I planned this on day one, I said. The merchant just confirmed the timing. More silence, the fire, the sound of the ocean, which had been there every night, and which I had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing things that become part of where you live. Rovan, what do we put on the delivery note? Name of the coast, I said. No sender, no request. One line. From the Famine Coast Administrative Zone, in surplus. He thought about it. That's going to confuse a lot of people in the capital, he said. Good, I said. Confused people ask questions. Questions create records. Records are what I need. The compass was warm against my chest through the coat fabric. Not vibrating, just warm. The way it got when I was on the right path, and it had nothing left to confirm because I'd already confirmed it myself. 40 barrels. They sent me here to disappear. I sent them fish instead. The delivery note came back 3 weeks later. Not from the Imperial Provisioning Office. From the office of Lord Harvin Crest, Imperial Supply Commissioner, Western Regions. It was not a thank you note. It was a formal Imperial order, stamped and sealed. All commercial activity on the Famine Coast Administrative Zone is hereby suspended pending review. The garrison assigned to the zone is reminded that unauthorized trade constitutes a violation of Imperial commerce regulations. Supply allocations will be reviewed at the Commissioner's discretion. Rovan read it aloud, then he looked at me. Every person around the fire that evening looked at me. I looked at the order for a long moment, at the seal, at the specific phrasing, unauthorized trade, pending review, Commissioner's discretion. Every word of it was Harvin. Not the Emperor, not the Imperial Court, not the Provisioning Office. Harvin. Which meant the 40 barrels had reached the capital, and the capital had sent them to Harvin for response. Which meant Harvin was now officially on record as having responded to a producing coast by ordering it to stop producing. He had just handed me the next piece of the case. Unauthorized trade, Colt said slowly. Is it unauthorized? Technically, I said. The Famine Coast Administrative Zone has no commerce regulations on record because it was classified as non-producing. There's nothing to authorize or prohibit because the classification assumed nothing was happening. I set the order down on the table. Harvin knows this. He's not trying to enforce a regulation. He's trying to create one, retroactively, so he has grounds to shut us down before we become visible enough that someone asks why we weren't receiving our supply allocation. Can he do that? Marin asked. He can try, I said, but he just put his name on a document ordering a producing zone to stop producing, in response to a surplus shipment to the imperial capital. That document is now part of the record. I looked at the order. He thinks he's stopping us. He's actually helping us. Tosker had been quiet through all of this. Now he leaned forward. What do we do? He said. We don't stop, I said. We don't acknowledge the order. We don't respond to it. We continue operating exactly as we have been. I paused. And tomorrow morning I start writing the counter document. What counter document? I reached into my coat and took out the ledger, Harvin's ledger, the one I'd found behind the crates on the first night, the one I'd been carrying against my chest for 3 weeks like a second heartbeat. I set it on the table. Everyone looked at it. 4 years of stolen allocation records, I said, in Harvin's own seal, cross-referenced against the official delivery logs, which I also have copies of, from my time in the logistics division. I looked around the table. His order says we're conducting unauthorized trade. My counter-document will show that the only unauthorized activity on this coast for the past 4 years has been his. Silence. Long this time. Then Rovan, quietly, he's going to come after us harder when he realizes we have that. Yes, I said. And you've known about this ledger since night 1. Yes? And you waited. I needed the coast to be producing first, I said. Evidence without a functioning operation is just an accusation. Evidence with 400 people fed and a surplus shipment already in the capital is a case. Unquote. I looked at the ledger. Harvin can't quietly redirect a case. The compass sat still in my coat pocket. It had nothing left to confirm tonight. I already knew what came next. The counter document took 11 days to write. Not because the material was complicated. The material was straightforward. Harvin's ledger cross-referenced against the official delivery logs. 4 years of discrepancies laid out in chronological order with the relevant seal numbers and authorization codes matched against each entry. Anyone with basic literacy and a working knowledge of imperial supply accounting could follow it. The 11 days were because I wrote it 3 times. The first version was angry. I didn't realize it was angry until I finished it and read it back and heard myself in every sentence. The clipped syntax, the unnecessary emphasis, the places where I had written deliberately falsified when inconsistent with official record said the same thing with more precision and less heat. Angry documents give the reader permission to dismiss the writer. I burned the first version in the smokehouse fire. The second version was too long. 41 pages. Comprehensive, exhaustive, airtight. And 41 pages, which meant that the person reading it would lose the thread somewhere around page 15 and start looking for reasons to set it down. I cut it to 19 pages. Then I cut it again to 14. Each cut made it stronger, because each cut forced me to decide what actually mattered, and what was just me wanting to include everything. The third version was 14 pages. Every number sourced, every discrepancy cited, every authorization code matched to its official counterpart. The tone was flat and procedural, the tone of a man who is not making an argument but simply recording what the documents show. The documents showed enough. They didn't need help from my opinions. I titled it, Discrepancy Report, Famine Coast Administrative Zone Supply Allocation, Years 1 to 4 of Current Imperial Reign, submitted for review. Not an accusation, a report. Reports get read, accusations get filed. Rovan read the final version over my shoulder on the evening of the 11th day. It's dry, he said. Good, I said. I mean very dry. I fell asleep twice. Also good, I said. Harvin is going to try to discredit this document. The easiest way to discredit a document is to find emotion in it and call it a grievance. There is no emotion in this document. There are only numbers and the spaces between what the numbers say and what the official record says. Rovan looked at it again. What do you do with it now? I make 6 copies, I said. 1 stays here. 1 goes with the next shipment to the capital, addressed to the Imperial Audit Office, not the Provisioning Office. 1 goes to the River Markets Trading Post at Aldenvane, held for safekeeping. 1 goes to Silas Marsh, with instructions to hold it unopened unless something happens to me. And the other 2? Insurance, I said. I'll tell you where when I've placed them. He looked at me. You think something might happen to you, he said. I think Harvin is a bureaucrat who has been operating without consequence for 4 years and has just received evidence that consequence is coming, I said. Bureaucrats who face consequence look for the document first. If the document disappears, the discrepancy disappears. I set down the pen. I am not going to be the only copy of this document. Rovan was quiet for a moment. I'll make the copies, he said. You can't. I can write, he said, with the mild offense of a man who has heard this assumption before. 22 years in the Imperial Army includes a significant amount of paperwork. I will make the copies. You sleep. You haven't slept properly in 11 days, and it's visible. I looked at him. You're not wrong, I said. I know, he said. Sleep. Silas Marsh came back on day 43. 3 weeks and 4 days after our initial agreement. 4 days late, which I had factored into the probability calculation but had still been watching the ridge for. He came with 2 wagons this time instead of 6, and a different set of guards, and the expression of a man who has had an interesting few weeks and is still processing them. He sat down across from me at the table I'd set up outside the station, a proper table now, timber from the 4th boat, planed flat by brick over 2 days of what he'd described as therapeutic work, and put a leather purse on it. Payment for the 50 pounds, he said. I opened the purse, counted, correct to the copper, and, I said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. The trading agreement. Standard Westmark terms, modified at 3 points as I indicated I would try to do. He paused. I modified 2 of the 3. The third, exclusive route rights, my factor principle wouldn't move on. I unfolded the agreement and read it. He waited without speaking, which told me he'd dealt with logistics people before and knew that interrupting a document review was counterproductive. The 2 modifications were reasonable. The exclusive route clause was not. It would have prevented me from establishing any other trading relationships on the Eastern Road, which I had no intention of accepting. The exclusive route clause comes out, I said. I'll accept right of first refusal on any Eastern Route cargo. You get the first offer before I approach any other merchant on that road. That's worth more than exclusivity because it means I'm actively bringing you business instead of just not selling to your competitors. Silas looked at me. You've negotiated trading agreements before, he said. I've reviewed them, I said. In the logistics division. I was usually on the other side of the table. Imperial supply? Imperial supply. He absorbed this. Then you know, he said carefully, that the Westmark Trading House has an existing contract with the Imperial Supply Commission for preserved goods distribution in the western regions. I know, I said, which means Harvin Crest is aware of my trading house. Which means, I said, that when you arrived here 3 weeks ago, it's possible you mentioned it to someone in his office. A pause. It's possible, Silas said. I file route reports with the commission. Standard practice. And the route report for the Western Cliff Road would have included a notation about an unexpected producing operation on the Famine Coast. He was very still now. I didn't know there was anything sensitive about. There isn't, I said. You reported accurately. That's not a problem. I looked at him. What I need to know is whether the commission's response to your report was a standard acknowledgement or something else. Silas reached into his coat a second time, put another folded document on the table. I opened it. It was a letter from the Imperial Supply Commission, addressed to the Westmark Trading House, informing them that any commercial engagement with the Famine Coast Administrative Zone was in violation of current suspension orders, and that contracts arising from such engagement would not be recognized by the Commission. Harvin, again. Moving faster than I'd expected. I read the letter twice, set it down. He sent this before you came back, I said. 2 weeks ago, Silas said. I came back anyway. He paused. Partly because 50 pounds of your fish had already sold at 12% above standard market rate at the Aldenvane trading post, and my principal was significantly interested in the margin, and partly because... He stopped. Because? I said. Because the letter was aggressive enough that it made me curious what you'd done to earn it. He looked at me steadily. Men who send letters like that are men who are worried. I've dealt with enough commission officials to know the difference between standard regulatory enforcement and a man trying to stop something specific. He nodded at the letter. That's a man trying to stop something specific. I looked at the letter for a moment, then I picked it up and added it to the stack of documents I'd been accumulating on the right side of the table. Harvin's original suspension order, the 4 copies of the discrepancy report, and now this. That letter, I said, is the 3rd time Harvin Crest has put his name on a document related to this coast since I sent 40 barrels to the capital. The first was the suspension order. The second was a follow-up memorandum to the provisioning office classifying this zone as commercially inactive, which I received a copy of through the administrative notification system because I'm still technically the garrison commander and entitled to zone notifications. I looked at Silas. Each document he produces trying to stop us is a document that shows the commission was aware of this coast, aware it was producing, and chose suppression over support. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "You're building something," he said, "not just the operation." "The operation is the evidence," I said. "The evidence is the point." He looked at the documents on the table, at the discrepancy report on top of the stack. "Can I ask," he said, "what you intend to do with all of it?" "Eventually," I said, "I intend to present it to someone with sufficient authority that Harvin can't intercept the presentation." "That's a short list of people," Silas said. "Yes," I said. "The shortest version of that list," he said carefully, "is one person." "Yes," I said. He was quiet again, looking at me with the expression of a man recalculating something. "The right of first refusal clause," he said finally. "I'll take it. In exchange, I want it on record that the Westmark Trading House cooperated with this operation in good faith against commission pressure." "I'll put it in writing today," I said. We shook hands. After he left, Tosker appeared from wherever Tosker always appeared from. He had a talent for being present at significant moments without having been visible approaching them. "New ally?" he said. "New witness," I said. "There's a difference." My brother Dorian arrived on day 51. I had been expecting him since day 30, when the news of our operation would have reached the capital through the provisioning gift and filtered into the kind of circles my family moved in. Dorian was many things, but he was not slow. He would have known what my survival meant for the story he'd spent 3 years maintaining, and he would have acted. He came with 12 guards, more than I had soldiers, which was probably intentional, and the manner of a man performing a kindness he finds mildly distasteful. My older brother, 34 to my 29. The same dark hair, the same jaw, but where I had inherited our mother's tendency to go quiet when thinking, Dorian had inherited our father's tendency to fill silence with noise. He had spent his life being charming. It had worked so well for so long that he had forgotten it was a technique and started believing it was a personality. He stood in the station yard and looked at everything: the smokehouse, the salt pans, the organized movement of people, the table outside with its stack of documents, and then looked at me with an expression that had been carefully assembled to communicate warm concern. "Kael," he said, "thank the Empire I found you. When I heard what had happened, when I realized what Father had allowed to happen, I came as quickly as I could." Every person in the yard who was close enough to hear stopped moving. I looked at my brother. I had not seen him in 3 years. 3 years since he'd stood in our father's study and watched me accept the blame for the grain shipment, the one he had misrouted, had pocketed the difference on, had covered with 3 layers of documentation that pointed at me. He had watched me take it. He had said nothing, and when I'd looked at him as I walked out, he had looked back with the specific expression of a man who feels regret, but not enough regret to do anything about it. "Dorian," I said. "You look well," he said, considering. "Come inside," I said. "We should talk." We sat at the inner table, just the two of us, though Roven was outside the door, in the way that Roven was outside doors, when he thought I might need him to be outside doors. Dorian looked around the station interior, at the organized stacks of records, at the harbor master's logs, at the copied documents lined up on the shelf I'd built along the eastern wall. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes," I said. "This is impressive, Kael, genuinely. What you've built here." He spread his hands. "Father would be proud." "Father sent me here," I said. A pause. "Father was pressured by the commissioner. You know how these things work. Political obligations, debts called in. It wasn't personal." "It was personal enough that my name is still on the exile order," I said. "Which is why I'm here." He leaned forward. "I've spoken to Father. He's willing to petition for a review of the sentence. There are grounds. The original charges were never formally adjudicated, just administratively processed. A proper review could see you restored, Kael. Your rank, your position." "Which position?" I said. "The one you took?" I silence. Dorian had been given my logistics posting 3 months after my exile. I had found this out from Silas, who had mentioned it in passing as the kind of thing he assumed I knew. I had not known. I knew now. "That was a temporary measure," Dorian said, "until the situation could be resolved. I've been protecting the posting for you." "The grain shipment," I said. He stopped. "The one 3 years ago," I said. "The one I took the blame for. I want to know where the grain went." Very still now. The charm switched off the way a lamp switches off, suddenly, completely. "That's not—" "The official record says the grain was lost in transit due to route mismanagement." "My route mismanagement." I looked at him. "I've been doing supply accounting for 3 weeks on this coast. I know what 60 tons of grain looks like in a ledger. I know what it looks like when it disappears versus when it's redirected. I paused. The grain didn't disappear, Dorian. It was redirected. The question is where? The expression on his face had moved past charm and past calculation into something older and less comfortable. The expression of someone who has built a careful structure and is watching the foundation shift. You can't prove that, he said. I can't prove it yet, I said, but I have Harvin's ledger. 4 years of supply allocations to this coast that never arrived, and Harvin and you have been connected since before my exile. I found the correspondence in the harbor master's records. Not explicit, but enough to show a relationship that predates any official business reason for one. Quat. This was a partial truth. The correspondence I'd found was thin. 2 letters, both administrative, both ambiguous. But Dorian didn't know how thin it was. You're accusing your own brother, he said. I'm telling you what I have, I said, and what I intend to do with it. Which is? Present it to the right person, I said. Complete, documented, in the correct procedural format, through the correct channels, not as an accusation, as a report. I looked at him. You came here to offer me a way out, to restore me quietly, on father's terms, in exchange for this. I gestured at the documents, going away. He said nothing. I don't need a way out, I said. I built a way forward. There's a difference. Dorian looked at me for a long moment. The last time I'd seen that look was in our father's study, as I walked out. Regret that stops short of action. Kael, he said, think carefully about what you're doing. Harvin has more reach than you understand. The commissioner's office has relationships throughout the imperial court. Judges, auditors, provisioning officials. If you push this formally, he will push back. And you are still technically an exile on a coast that the commission has ordered to cease operations. I know, I said. Then you know that formally, he can still bury you. Formally, I said, he already tried. He sent a suspension order. I didn't suspend. He sent a commercial prohibition to my trading partner. My trading partner came back anyway. He classified this zone as commercially inactive while I was actively shipping surplus to the capital. End quote. I met my brother's eyes. Every time Harvin acts formally, he creates a document, and every document he creates becomes part of a record that shows a commissioner systematically suppressing a producing zone. I paused. He keeps trying to bury me with paperwork. I keep filing the paperwork in a different drawer. Silence. Then Dorian very quietly, what do you want? I want what's already in the record, I said. I don't need you to give me anything. I need you to stay out of what comes next. He looked at me. And if I don't? Then what I have on Harvin, I said, becomes part of a larger report that includes the grain shipment, and your name in connection with his, and the timeline that shows the exile followed the grain audit by 11 days. Towardine. 11 days. I hadn't known it was 11 days until Silas had mentioned the date of my exile order, and I'd matched it against the audit records I'd found in the harbor master's correspondence files. 11 days between the audit flagging the grain discrepancy and the exile order being issued. 11 days was not a coincidence. It was a sequence. Dorian knew that I knew it was a sequence. He stood up. I'll return to the capital, he said. Safe travels, I said. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. You were always better at this than me, he said. Not warmly, just accurately. At what? I said. The accounting, he said. The numbers. I could never keep track of all of it the way you could. He paused. I should have known you'd find the discrepancy eventually. He left. I sat at the table for a long time after he was gone. The compass was warm against my chest, not vibrating, just warm. Outside, I could hear the station yard returning to its rhythm, fishing crews, salt crews, smoking crews, the continuous organized motion of 243 people who had built something real out of 9 days of rations and a cliff and a report that nobody had read. Rovin came in after a while. He's gone, he said. I know. Did it go the way you needed it to? I thought about the 11 days, about the grain, about the ledger in my coat and the counter document on the shelf, and the 6 copies placed in 6 different locations, and Silas Marsh's letter from the commission, and 40 barrels of fish that had arrived in the capital, and started a chain of events that Harvin was now running out of paperwork to stop. It went the way it needed to go, I said. What's next? I reached into my coat, took out the compass. The needle spun, locked east, directly east, toward the capital. We've been summoned, I said. Rovin looked at the compass. We haven't received a summons. Not yet, I said, but we will. I put the compass away. Start preparing. I want the full production record ready. Every day, every number, every batch. I want Harvin's ledger copied twice more, and I want this station running well enough that it keeps running without me. For how long? I looked at the shelf of documents, 14 pages of discrepancy report, 4 years of Harvin's records, 3 of his orders trying to shut us down, Silas's letter, the 11-day sequence, the 40 barrels that had started all of it. Long enough? I said. The summons arrived 4 days later, not from Harvin, from the Imperial Audit Office. The Imperial Audit Office summons was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph established jurisdiction. The Audit Office had authority to review any discrepancy report filed through official channels, including discrepancies involving the Imperial Supply Commission. The second paragraph specified the date and location, 14 days hence, at the audit hall in the capital. The third paragraph listed the documents I was required to bring. The list matched exactly what I had. I read the third paragraph 3 times. Someone in the audit office had read my report carefully enough to know what documentation would be needed to support it. That was either routine procedural thoroughness, or it was someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of report and knew the shape of the case before I'd filed it. I didn't know which. It didn't change what I needed to do. I spent the 4 days before departure getting the station ready to run without me. Not because I was worried about the operation. Marin had been effectively running the production side for 3 weeks and would not notice my absence, except as a reduction in the number of people asking her questions she'd already answered. Tosker managed the community with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been organizing people through hard circumstances for 50 years. Rovan would maintain security and headcount and the daily ledger I'd established for continuity tracking. What I spent the 4 days on was documentation transfer. Every original document stayed at the station, in the locked chest I'd built into the backroom wall. Harvin's ledger, the harbor master's logs, the 12 years of catch records, the official delivery confirmations showing what hadn't arrived. The copies went with me. Clean copies, on good paper, organized in the order I intended to present them. On the evening before departure, Tosker came to find me at the document table. He sat down across from me without being invited, the way he always did, and looked at the organized stacks. "You're nervous," he said. "I'm prepared," I said. "Those aren't opposites," he said. I set down the pen. "I've been building this case for 55 days, I said. Every document, every number, every copy placed in a separate location. The case is sound. The evidence is documented. The procedural filing is correct." I looked at the stack. "And Harvin Crest has been operating in the capital for 12 years. He knows people I don't know. He has relationships with auditors and judges and court officials that were built over a decade of small favors and shared interests." End quote. I paused. A sound case and a favorable hearing are not the same thing. Tosker nodded slowly. "My wife," he said, "used to say that the difference between a good argument and a winning argument is the room you make it in." Smart woman. She was. He looked at the documents. "What room are you walking into?" "The audit hall," I said. "Formal tribunal. 3 auditors, senior officials, appointed by the Imperial Court. They review the evidence, hear both presentations, issue a ruling." I paused. "Harvin will have representation, a formal advocate, someone who knows tribunal procedure better than I do, and whose entire purpose is to find the weakness in my documentation." "Do you have an advocate?" "No." Tosker looked at me. "I considered it," I said. "But an advocate who doesn't understand supply accounting will slow down the presentation, and an advocate who does understand supply accounting will want to control the presentation, which means the parts that matter most, the specific discrepancies, the authorization codes, the 4-year pattern, get filtered through someone else's judgment about what a tribunal will find compelling." I looked at the stack. "I know this material. I built it. I can present it faster and more precisely than anyone I could hire in 14 days. "And if you're wrong about that," Tosker said. "Then I lose the tribunal," I said, "and Harvin issues another order, and we find another route." "Can we?" he said. "If the tribunal rules against you, does Harvin have grounds to enforce the suspension?" "Yes," I said. Silence. "Then you need to win," Tosker said. "Yes," I said. He stood, put a hand briefly on the table, not quite on the documents, and then withdrew it. 243 people, he said, in case that's useful to remember. "It's useful," I said. "Thank you, Tosker." He nodded and left. I sat at the table for another hour, going through the documents one more time, not because I needed to, because the repetition had a function. Each pass through the material settled it further into a structure I could access under pressure, in order, without hesitation. The tribunal wouldn't give me time to search through papers. I needed the sequence in my head as clearly as it was on the page. 14 pages, 47 discrepancy entries, 4 years. The pattern was simple. The documentation was complete. I closed the stack and tied the cord around it. The compass sat on the table beside me. I hadn't put it in my coat yet. I picked it up. The needle was still. Had been still since it locked east 4 days ago. No new confirmation needed. The direction was set. The decision was made. The compass had nothing left to tell me tonight. I put it in my coat anyway. Old habit. The capital took 3 days to reach by the coastal road east, then the river highway north. I traveled with 2 people, Rovan, who had announced he was coming in the tone of a man who has already decided and is informing, rather than requesting, and Colt, who had asked with the directness that had characterized everything he'd done since the cliff, and who I'd said yes to, because he was quick and observant, and I wanted someone in the room who could watch the faces of the tribunal while I was watching the documents. We arrived on the evening of the 13th day, found lodgings near the Audit Hall district, clean, cheap, the kind of place used by merchants and minor officials on tribunal business, which meant the proprietor had seen enough of this type of visit to know not to ask questions. Colt went out to walk the district, not for any specific purpose. I'd learned on the coast that Colt processed information best through movement, and that his observations when he came back from an unstructured walk were usually sharper than anything produced by directed reconnaissance. Rovan stayed. He sat across from me at the small table in our room and looked at the document stack. "Tell me what happens tomorrow," he said. "Not what are you going to do. Tell me what happens." The distinction was deliberate. He was asking me to walk through it aloud because he knew, from 3 days of travel with me, that I'd been running it silently, and that silent rehearsal had a ceiling. I told him. We arrive at the audit hall at the 2nd bell. Tribunal convenes at the 3rd. 3 auditors, Chief Auditor Wesson, who has a reputation for procedural precision and almost no published opinions that would indicate political alignment, Senior Auditor Crane, who has ruled against commission overreach twice in the past 6 years, and Junior Auditor Pell, who is 3 years into the position and tends to follow the senior auditor's lead in complex cases. I'd spent 2 days of the journey learning what Silas knew about the audit office. Silas knew a considerable amount. Harvin's advocate is a man named Torval, experienced, thorough, specializes in regulatory defense. His standard approach is to challenge the provenance of documentation before engaging the substance. "Meaning he'll say your documents are fake," Rovan said. "He'll say they're unverified," I said, which is different and harder to argue against. My copies are copies. The originals are at the station. He'll argue that copies without chain of custody verification are inadmissible as primary evidence. And are they inadmissible? Under strict tribunal procedure. Yes, I said. Under the audit office's specific charter, there's a provision for field documentation submitted by garrison commanders in active administrative zones. The Famine Coast is still technically an active administrative zone. The suspension order didn't dissolve the zone, it suspended its commercial operations, which means I'm still technically the garrison commander, which means the field documentation provision applies. I paused. Torval will argue the suspension order voided my garrison status. I will argue the suspension order was itself procedurally irregular because it was issued by the commissioner in response to a surplus shipment rather than in response to any documented violation. Rovan was quiet for a moment. "That's a fine distinction," he said. "Most of what happens in a tribunal is fine distinctions," I said. "The documents are clear. The pattern is clear. But pattern and documents don't win tribunals by themselves. The procedural framing wins tribunals. The pattern and documents are what the procedural framing is built around. What if Torval has something you haven't anticipated?" I thought about this. Then I listened to it, I said. And I respond to what he actually says rather than what I expected him to say. I looked at the document stack. The one thing I have that Torval doesn't is that I built this case from primary sources. Every number in that report I pulled from an original document myself. I know where every entry came from and what the surrounding entries look like. Torval has seen my report and Harvin's counterfiling and whatever supporting material Harvin's office produced. He hasn't seen the original harbor master's logs. He hasn't seen what's on either side of the specific entries I cited. I paused. If he challenges provenance, I can describe the physical condition of the source documents in enough detail that a procedural challenge becomes harder to maintain than just accepting the copies. Rovan absorbed this. "You've done this before," he said. "Not a tribunal," I said. "Supply audits, internal review boards. The structure is the same. Evidence, procedure, presentation. The stakes are different. Higher." Yes, I said. Higher. Colt came back an hour later, sat down without being asked, looked at both of us. Harvin is at the Grand Commission Hall, he said, 3 blocks from the audit hall. He arrived this morning with 6 staff members and 2 advocates. Not 1, 2. He's been in meetings since mid-afternoon. 2 advocates. I looked at the document stack. 2 advocates meant Harvin was treating this as a serious threat rather than a nuisance suppression, which meant either he was more worried than his 3 increasingly aggressive orders had suggested, or he had information about the tribunal composition that I didn't, or both. Anything else? I said. The Grand Commission Hall has a courier going to the audit hall at regular intervals, Colt said. I counted 4 trips since mid-afternoon. That's once every hour and a half, roughly. Active communication between Harvin's office and the audit hall, evening before the tribunal. I looked at this from 2 directions. Direction 1. Harvin was filing last-minute procedural challenges, which meant he was trying to shape the rules of the proceeding before it began. Standard practice for a well-resourced respondent. Direction 2. He was communicating with someone inside the audit hall, which meant the room Tosker's wife had described was already being worked before I entered it. I couldn't know which direction was correct. Possibly both. Roven, I said. The copies at the trading post in Aldenvane, Silas has them? Confirmed before we left, he said. And the copy with the garrison station records? Locked chest. Marin has the key. Tosker has a copy of the key. Good. I looked at the document stack one more time. Then I picked it up, put it in the oilskin satchel I'd been using since the coast, and set the satchel by the door. Sleep, I said. 3rd bell comes early. The audit hall was older than I expected. I had imagined something that matched the weight of what happened inside it. Imposing, deliberate, built to communicate authority. What I found was a 3-story stone building with worn steps and a door that stuck slightly in its frame, requiring the attendant to lean into it. The interior was high-ceilinged and cold, with the particular quality of cold that belongs to rooms that have been cold for a long time and have stopped pretending otherwise. The tribunal chamber was on the 2nd floor. We arrived at the 2nd bell. Harvin was already there. He was seated at the respondent's table with his 2 advocates, Torval, who I recognized from the description Silas had given me, and a younger woman whose name I didn't know, but whose document organization suggested she was handling the procedural filings while Torval handled the presentation. Harvin himself sat between them. He was shorter than I'd expected from someone whose name had occupied so much space in my thinking for the past 2 months. A compact man in his 50s with a bureaucrat's posture and a bureaucrat's face, the kind of face that has learned to reveal nothing, because revealing nothing is professionally useful. He looked at me when I entered. I looked back. Neither of us said anything. I sat at the petitioner's table. Roven took the chair behind me. Colt positioned himself at the side of the room where he had a clear sightline to the tribunal bench and both tables. The 3 auditors entered at the 3rd bell precisely. Chief Auditor Wesson was older than I'd anticipated, late 60s, with the deliberate movement of someone who has learned that moving slowly gives you more time to observe. Senior Auditor Crane was 50, sharp-faced, with the quality of attention that meant he'd already read everything filed and formed preliminary opinions he was here to test. Junior Auditor Pell was exactly as described. Young, careful, watching the senior auditors. Wesson called the proceeding to order. We are convened to review a discrepancy report filed by Kael Donridge, Garrison Commander, Famine Coast Administrative Zone, concerning supply allocation records for said zone, years 1 through 4 of current Imperial reign. Respondent is Harvin Crest, Imperial Supply Commissioner, Western Regions. End quote. He looked at both tables. Petitioner presents first. Respondent presents in reply. Questions from the bench follow. We proceed. He looked at me. I stood. I had 14 pages. I presented 10. Not because the other 4 were weak. They were the strongest section, the direct discrepancy comparisons between Harvin's ledger and the official delivery logs. I held them back because Torval's challenge to provenance, when it came, would require me to introduce them in response rather than in primary presentation. If I presented them first, Torval could challenge them first and shape the tribunal's initial impression of the documents. If I held them, he would have to challenge them after the tribunal had already seen the pattern the first 10 pages established. The first 10 pages showed the pattern without the most damning evidence. The pattern alone was persuasive. The most damning evidence would arrive after Torval had already committed to a line of attack. I had practiced the 10-page presentation until I could deliver it in under 20 minutes. I delivered it in 19. When I sat down, Crane was leaning forward slightly. Wesson was writing, Pell was watching Harvin. Torvald stood. He was good. Better than good, he was precise and confident, and he moved through the procedural challenge to my documentation with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly which threads to pull. The petitioner's documentation, he said, consists entirely of copies. The originals, by the petitioner's own account, remain at the Famine Coast. Chain of custody for these copies is unverified. Under Audit Tribunal Protocol Section 7, Clause 4, unverified copies do not constitute primary evidence and cannot be admitted as the basis for a finding of discrepancy. He sat down. Wesson looked at me. I stood. The Audit Office Charter, I said, Section 12, Clause 9, establishes a field documentation provision for active garrison commanders submitting records from active administrative zones. The Famine Coast Administrative Zone remains active. The Commissioner's suspension order, which I have in evidence, suspended commercial operations within the zone but did not dissolve the zone or reassign its garrison command. I remain the garrison commander of an active zone, and these copies were produced by me from primary sources, in my capacity as garrison commander. The field documentation provision applies. Torvald was on his feet before I finished. The suspension order, I said, was issued in direct response to a surplus shipment from this zone to the Imperial Provisioning Office. No documented violation preceded it. Under Commission Protocol, suspension orders require a documented violation as precondition. The order itself is procedurally irregular, which is a separate matter I have documentation for, but its procedural irregularity also means it cannot be used to void a garrison command it had no valid grounds to effect. Silence in the room. Wesson looked at the suspension order I'd placed in the submission stack. Then he looked at Harvin. Harvin's face had not changed, but something behind it had. Crane spoke for the first time. The petitioner mentions documentation of the order's procedural irregularity. Is this included in the submission? It is, I said. Pages 11 through 14, which I held from initial presentation, pending the provenance challenge. Crane looked at Wesson. Wesson looked at Torvald. Torvald said nothing. He had committed to the provenance challenge, and the provenance challenge had been answered before he could use the suspension order as support for it. He was recalculating, which took time, and time in a tribunal belongs to whoever is standing. I was standing. Pages 11 through 14, I said, contain a direct comparison of the Commissioner's official delivery logs for the Famine Coast Administrative Zone against an allocation ledger bearing the Commissioner's seal, recovered from the zone's harbor master's records. The comparison shows 47 instances across 4 years in which Category C rations were authorized, downgraded to Category D, and recorded as delivered when no delivery was made. End quote. I looked at the tribunal bench. The allocation ledger is an original document. It is not a copy. It was recovered from the zone in its original form and has been in my continuous possession since day one of the current garrison assignment. It is submitted as primary evidence under the field documentation provision. Wesson's pen had stopped moving. Crane was looking at the page I'd just placed on the submission table, the first page of the direct comparison, with Harvin's seal visible in the top right corner. Pell was watching Harvin. So was I. Harvin's face was still. The stillness of a man who has just understood that the thing he was most worried about was real and present in this room, in original form, and that the next several minutes were going to determine whether the last 4 years of careful management were about to become very visible to 3 people with the authority to act on what they saw. Torvald stood again. He was good. I had to give him that. He found his footing faster than most would have. The allocation ledger, he said, while original, requires authentication. The seal must be verified by the Commissioner's office before... The Commissioner, Wesson said, without looking up from the page in front of him, is present in this room. Silence. Commissioner Crest, Wesson said, is this your office seal? Harvin looked at the page. A long moment. It is, he said. His voice was flat, completely flat. The voice of a man who has just made the only available correct procedural move, which was to authenticate the document before the tribunal could note his hesitation, because hesitation in authenticating your own seal was its own kind of evidence. He was good too. I had known he would be. But he had just confirmed the ledger. The ledger is admitted, Wesson said. He looked at both tables. We'll recess for 1 hour. Counsel will prepare responses to the submitted documentation. Petitioner will be available for bench questions upon reconvening. I went to the corridor outside the chamber. Roven was beside me. Colt appeared from the side door 30 seconds later. Pell, Colt said quietly, looked at Harvin when Wesson asked about the seal. Not at the document, at Harvin. He was watching for the reaction. I saw, I said. Crane had already read to page 12 before Wesson called the recess, Colt said. He was ahead of the presentation. He read the full submission before the proceeding, I said. He knew what was in pages 11 through 14. He was waiting for the provenance challenge to be answered so the documents could be formally admitted. Rovin looked at me. Crane wanted them admitted. Crane wanted to see if I could get them admitted correctly, I said. There's a difference. He didn't do it for me. He created the conditions. I had to do it myself. And Harvin? Rovin said. He authenticated the seal. He had no choice, I said. Denying your own seal in front of a tribunal that can verify it through 3 other channels is worse than admitting a document you'd rather wasn't admitted. I looked at the door to the chamber. He authenticated the ledger. Now he has to explain the 47 discrepancies in it. Torval will try to characterize them as administrative error, processing delays, seasonal adjustments, clerical misclassification. Can he? For some of them, I said. Not for all 47 across 4 consecutive years showing the same pattern. Pattern is harder to explain as error than individual instances. I paused. The question is whether Harvin has documentation that creates an alternative explanation. If he's prepared for this, if he's had 12 years to build contingency records. Has he? Colt said. I thought about the 11 days between the grain audit and my exile, the precision of the suspension order, the speed of the letter to Silas, the 2 advocates and 4 courier trips the night before. He's prepared for something, I said. I don't know if it's this exactly. Rovin, what do we do in the hour? We wait, I said, and we go back in. Torval's response presentation was 40 minutes. It was, as I had anticipated, a characterization of the discrepancies as administrative processing delays, a systemic issue with the zone's reclassification during the early years of the current reign, compounded by clerical errors in the allocation coding system. He produced documentation, 12 pages of it, internal commission records showing allocation processing timelines, reclassification orders, and a memorandum from 3 years into the reign acknowledging a zone-wide coding discrepancy that had since been corrected. The memorandum was real. I could tell from the way Crane handled it. He examined it without the slight additional attention that indicated surprise, which meant he'd seen it or something like it before in pre-tribunal review. The memorandum was also 3 years old and covered the first 2 years of the discrepancy period. The memorandum, I said, when Wesson invited my response, addresses years 1 and 2 of the discrepancy period. The discrepancies in years 3 and 4, 23 of the 47 entries, post-date the memorandum's acknowledged correction. If the coding issue was corrected, the discrepancies should have ended. They didn't. End quote. I placed the relevant comparison pages on the submission table. Years 3 and 4 show the same pattern as years 1 and 2, despite the correction. The administrative error explanation accounts for half the evidence. It doesn't account for the other half. Crane leaned forward. Commissioner, he said, looking at Harvin directly. The zone coding correction referenced in your memorandum, when was it implemented? Harvin, the 4th month of year 3. And the discrepancies in the petitioner's documentation for year 3 begin in... Crane looked at my submission pages. The 2nd month of year 3. The correction was in implementation during that period, Harvin said. Processing lag. Processing lag for 2 months is standard, Crane said. Processing lag for 2 years, following a documented correction, is not standard. He set the page down. The Commission will need to provide implementation records for the correction. Specifically, the processing confirmations showing the zone's allocation coding was updated in the Commission's central system. Silence. Harvin looked at Torval. Torval looked at his documents. The implementation records either existed or they didn't. If they existed, the processing lag argument might hold for year 3. Year 4 would still require explanation. If they didn't exist, the correction memorandum was a memorandum about a correction that had never been fully implemented, which was a different kind of document than the one Torval had presented it as. Wesson looked at the clock on the wall. We are past the standard session time, he said. This tribunal will reconvene in 3 days to allow the Commission to produce the implementation records. Petitioner is to remain available in the capital. He looked at both tables. Both parties are reminded that no further documentation may be introduced without prior bench approval. He closed his ledger. The tribunal rose. 3 days in the capital. I spent the first day going over everything again, not looking for new material, but checking what I had against what Torval had introduced, identifying the gaps, mapping what the implementation records might show, and what each scenario meant for the proceeding. The second day, Silas Marsh found me. He hadn't been in the tribunal chamber. I hadn't told him the date. But Silas moved through the trading and administrative districts of the capital the way water moves through rock, by finding the path of least resistance and following it wherever it led. He sat across from me at the lodging house table. "The implementation records don't exist," he said. I looked at him. "The coding correction was issued as a memorandum," he said. "The central system update was assigned to a junior clerk in the Commission's administrative division who was transferred to the eastern regions 2 months after the assignment. The update was never completed. I know this because the trading house filed a zone classification inquiry with the Commission 18 months ago, and the response came back with the old coding, which we flagged and were told was a system legacy issue." He put a folded document on the table. "The Commission's response to our inquiry, dated 18 months ago, shows the old zone coding still active." I picked it up and read it. 18 months ago, well after Harvin's memorandum, the coding was still wrong, which meant the memorandum had documented a correction that was never made, which meant 47 discrepancies across 4 years with no administrative explanation that held. I set the document down. "Silas," I said, "this is evidence in an active tribunal proceeding. If I use it, you become a formal witness." "I know," he said. "Harvin will know the trading house gave it to me, the commission contract." "The commission contract is worth less than the margin on your fish," he said. I did the math. He nodded at the document. "Use it." I looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Win." On the 3rd day, the commission produced its implementation records. They were incomplete. Not obviously falsified, incomplete. The processing confirmations showed the coding update had been initiated but not finalized. A gap of 8 months in the documentation, during which the central system should have been updated and the records showed nothing. Torvald presented them as evidence of ongoing implementation, a complex system update that had taken longer than anticipated due to administrative constraints. I presented Silas's document. Bench approval for new documentation required a motion. I filed the motion at the start of the reconvened session. Crane approved it before Wesson had finished reading the motion text. Torvald objected. Wesson overruled. I placed the trading house inquiry response on the submission table. 18 months after the memorandum, I said, the zone coding was still wrong. An external trading house inquiry documented it. The commission's response acknowledged it as a legacy issue. I looked at the bench. Not an issue in implementation. A legacy issue. The language of a system that has not been updated. Not a system that is in the process of being updated. I paused. The administrative error explanation requires an error that was being corrected. The documentation shows an error that was never corrected, which returns us to the 47 discrepancies with no administrative explanation that accounts for the pattern. Wesson set down his pen. He looked at Harvin for a long moment. "Commissioner," he said, "is there documentation the Commission has not yet produced that would account for the post-correction discrepancies?" Harvin was still. Torvald leaned toward him. A brief, low exchange that neither I nor the bench could hear. Then Harvin looked at Wesson. "No," he said. "One word." Wesson wrote something. Crane wrote something. Pell looked at the submission table. "This tribunal will issue its finding within 7 days," Wesson said. "Both parties are to remain available for notification. Proceeding is closed." The finding came in 4. I was at the lodging house table with Rovin and Colt when the audit office courier arrived. I signed for the document, opened it, read it once. Then I read it again. Finding: the discrepancy report filed by Kael Donridge, Garrison Commander, Famine Coast Administrative Zone, is upheld in full. The supply allocation records for said zone show a pattern of systematic misallocation inconsistent with administrative error. The matter is referred to the Imperial Review Commission for investigation of the Imperial Supply Commissioner, Western Regions. Commissioner Harvin Crest is suspended from office pending the outcome of said investigation. Garrison command of the Famine Coast Administrative Zone is confirmed. The commercial suspension order dated is voided as procedurally irregular. I set it down. Rovin read it. Then Colt. Then Rovin looked at me. "We won," he said. "The tribunal upheld the report," I said. "The investigation is separate. Harvin is suspended, not removed. The investigation could take months." "But we won," Rovin said. I looked at the finding. Garrison command confirmed. Suspension order voided. Commercial operations resumed as of the date of the finding. 243 people on a coast that the Empire had formally decided did not matter. Formally deciding they were wrong. "We won," I said. Colt leaned back in his chair, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a long exhale. "What happens now?" he said. I folded the finding and put it in the oilskin satchel with the rest of the documents. Now, I said, we go home. The coastal road back took 3 days. Same road we'd come in on, River Highway south, then the Cliff Road west. Same distance, different weight. On the way to the capital, I had been carrying the case. The documents, the preparation, the contingency plans for what Torval might do, and what Crane's preliminary reading might mean, and whether the implementation records would exist or not. Every mile of that journey had been occupied by variables I couldn't fully control, and outcomes I could only partially predict. On the way back, I carried the finding. 1 document, 4 paragraphs, garrison command confirmed, suspension order voided, commercial operations resumed. The weight was different because it was finished weight rather than unfinished weight. Finished weight sits differently on a person. It doesn't press, it just rests. Rovan rode beside me and said almost nothing for the first day, which was how I knew he was processing something significant. Rovan in motion was a quiet man. Rovan processing something was quieter. On the evening of the first day, camped at a way station on the river road, he finally said it. You knew about the implementation records, he said, before Silas came. I looked at the fire. I suspected, I said, the memorandum was too convenient. A correction issued at exactly the right time to cover the first half of the discrepancy period. If it had been genuine, Harvin would have produced the implementation records immediately when the tribunal was called. He had 2 advocates and 4 courier trips the night before the proceeding. If the records existed, he would have had them ready. You didn't know Silas would bring you the trading house inquiry. No, I said, I didn't know that. What would you have done without it? I thought about this honestly. The post-correction discrepancies alone were enough to challenge the administrative error explanation, I said. Crane had already caught it. The 2 years of continued discrepancy after a documented correction. I might not have needed the trading house inquiry to establish the challenge, but the inquiry made it definitive rather than argumentative. End quote. I paused. Without it, the finding might have been partial. Harvin suspended pending investigation, but the discrepancy report only partially upheld. Some room for the commission to manage the investigation's scope. And with it? Upheld in full, I said, which means the investigation has a specific mandate. It can't be managed into a narrow scope, because the finding establishes the full 4-year pattern as the subject. Rovan was quiet for a moment. Silas took a risk, he said. Yes, I said. He did. Why? I thought about Silas sitting across from me at the lodging house table. The folded document placed without ceremony. Use it. Because the trading house inquiry had been sitting in his files for 18 months as evidence of something wrong that nobody had addressed. I said, people who work in systems that aren't functioning correctly accumulate that kind of evidence. Most of the time they hold it because the cost of using it seems higher than the benefit. Unquote. I looked at the fire. When the benefit became clear, he used it. Rovan absorbed this. You gave him the benefit, he said. The fish gave him the benefit, I said. 12% above standard market rate at Aldenvane. I just gave him the reason to act on what he already had. Colt, who had been pretending to sleep against his saddle pack, opened one eye. You make everything sound like a supply chain. Everything is a supply chain, I said. Information, loyalty, risk, evidence. Things move between people based on what they're worth at each point in the chain. If you understand the value at each point, you understand the movement. Colt closed his eye again. That's either very wise or very boring. Both, Rovan said. We came over the last ridge above the Famine Coast on the afternoon of the 3rd day. I had not planned to stop at the ridge. I had planned to ride straight down to the station, but the horse stopped, or I stopped the horse without deciding to, and we stood at the top of the ridge and looked down at what the coast had become. 3 months ago, this had been a ragged line of pale cliffs and gray water and no smoke from any settlement. Now there was smoke. 3 separate columns of it, the smokehouse, the cook fires at the station, and a new fire further north that I didn't recognize and would need to investigate. The harbor had both fishing boats in the water and what appeared to be a third, the one with the missing bench planks, which meant someone had found replacement timber. The salt pans on the northern shelf caught the afternoon light at an angle that made them visible from the ridge, white rectangles against dark rock. The station itself had acquired 2 additional structures since I'd left. Low, stone-walled, practical, built in the same style as the original. 243 people living on a coast the Empire had classified as non-producing, making it produce anyway. Rovan stopped beside me. He looked at it for a moment. When I was assigned to this exile detail, he said, I thought it was a punishment posting, escort duty for a disgraced noble, nothing after. It was a punishment posting, I said. For you, he said. For me it turned out to be... He stopped, seemed to decide that whatever he was going to say was either too large or too imprecise, and set it aside. It turned out to be something else. I looked at him. 22 years in the Imperial Army, the Northern campaigns, the river wars, the border pacification, and then a cliff, and 9 days of rations and 2 months of building something from nothing with 11 other men and 230 refugees from a failed farming settlement. Roven, I said, Sir, when this is fully settled, when the investigation is complete and the garrison is formally restructured, I'm going to need a permanent second-in-command for this zone. Someone who understands both the security requirements and the operational logistics. Hang quote. I looked at the coast. The posting comes with permanent quarters, operational authority in my absence, and a salary drawn from the zone's commercial revenue rather than the Imperial supply allocation. A pause. Which means, Roven said slowly, it doesn't depend on Harvin's successor honoring the allocation. It means it doesn't depend on anyone in the commission for anything, I said. Another pause. Longer. Yes, he said. Not I'll consider it, or that's generous, or any of the forms that acceptance takes when the person accepting wants to appear measured. Just yes. The answer of a man who had already known what his answer would be and was relieved to be asked formally. Good, I said. Let's go down. Marin met us at the station gate. She looked at the three of us, then at me specifically, with the expression of someone who has been running an operation in the absence of its architect and has strong opinions about what needs to be reported first. The finding, she said. Upheld in full, I said. Suspension order voided. Commercial operations confirmed. I nodded once. Not with relief, with the satisfaction of a confirmed calculation. She had expected this, and was pleased that the data matched the expectation. Third boat is operational, she said, already moving toward the station as I dismounted. Brick found replacement planks from the collapsed section of the old village hall, structural grade, better than the originals. First run yesterday, 14 additional fish above the daily average. Salt Pan North extension is complete, yield is up to 17 pounds per day. The new structures are storage. We ran out of dry space for the preserved stock 3 weeks ago. Current inventory is 2,100 pounds. 2,100 pounds of preserved smoked fish. From 9 days of rations and a cliff. The new fire on the northern shelf? I said. Second smokehouse, she said. Started 8 days ago. The first one couldn't keep pace with production once the third boat was running. It'll be fully operational by end of week. I stopped walking, looked at her. You built a second smokehouse, I said. The first one had a bottleneck, she said. The solution to a bottleneck is parallel capacity. She met my eyes. Was that wrong? No, I said. That was exactly right. I paused. Where did you source the materials? Timber from the 2 boats that were beyond salvage. Stone from the collapsed village hall. Labor from Tosker's people. 18 of them have been on construction rotation since the first week. She paused. I kept the continuity ledger updated. Everything is documented. I know it is, I said. She started moving again. I fell into step beside her. Marin, I said. Sir, the second smokehouse, when did you decide to build it? Day 32, she said, when the production numbers showed the first one would hit capacity by day 45. Day 32, 13 days before I'd left for the capital. You didn't tell me, I said. You had the tribunal to prepare for, she said. The smokehouse decision didn't require your input. I knew the material sources. I had the labor. The logic was straightforward. Telling you would have added an item to your preparation load that didn't need to be there. She glanced at me. Was that wrong? No, I said again. She had been running this coast, not maintaining it, running it, making decisions, solving bottlenecks, extending capacity, keeping the ledger. The operation had not paused while I was absent. It had grown. This was a different kind of thing than I had built. I had built a survival operation. Marin had turned it into something that didn't need me present to keep moving forward. That was better than what I'd planned. It was better than what I'd known to plan for. Tosker found me an hour later, when I had gone through the ledger and confirmed the numbers and walked the new storage structures and stood in the second smokehouse smelling the driftwood smoke and understanding that the thing that had started with a cliff and 9 days and a report nobody had read had become something that had its own momentum now, its own logic, its own direction that didn't depend on any single person's continued presence. Welcome back, he said. Thank you for holding it together, I said. Marin held it together, he said. My people worked. There's a difference. He paused. The tribunal? Upheld, I said. Harvin is suspended. Investigation ongoing. He nodded. And your brother? He said. I looked at him. What about my brother? He came back, Tosker said. 4 days after you left for the capital. With a different escort, imperial officials, not his own guards. He had a document. He paused. A reassignment order, signed by the commissioner's office, assigning him to the Famine Coast Administrative Zone as Civilian Oversight Administrator. I was still. Harvin assigned my brother to oversight of the zone I'd just filed a discrepancy report against, I said. That was my reading of it, Tosker said. Marin's too. What did Marin do? She told him the garrison commander's authority superseded civilian oversight appointments that hadn't been confirmed by the audit office, and that pending the tribunal's finding, no new administrative appointments would be recognized. Tosker's expression moved toward something that might, in another man, have been a smile. She used those words exactly. I think she'd been preparing them. She had, I said. We discussed that scenario the night before I left. I paused. Where is Dorian now? He's been staying in the old harbor master's office, Tosker said. He can't leave. The reassignment order requires him to be present in the zone until confirmed or rescinded, and he can't be confirmed until the audit office rules. So he's been... Tosker paused, searching for the right word. Waiting. My brother. Waiting in the harbor master's office. The same office where I had found Harvin's ledger on the first night, where I had sat on the floor in the dark with a 4-year record of systematic theft against my chest, and understood that I had exactly one advantage and exactly 9 days to start building something with it. Dorian had been in that room for weeks. I wondered if he'd looked at the walls and understood what had happened there. I found him in the early evening. He was sitting at the table in the back room, the same table I'd used, the same chair, with a book open in front of him that he wasn't reading. He looked up when I came in. His face did the rapid series of calculations that his face always did when he encountered a situation he hadn't prepared for, and then settled into something careful and neutral. You won, he said. The tribunal upheld the report, I said. Harvin is suspended. I know, he said. Word travels. I sat down across from him. The same positions as our conversation 6 weeks ago, but reversed. I was on his side of the table now, and he was on mine. I didn't think he'd noticed. He had never been good at spatial symbolism. The reassignment order, I said. Harvin's idea, he said. Not mine. He contacted Father. Father contacted me. The logic was that a civilian oversight appointment from within the family would make the tribunal less likely to... He stopped. It doesn't matter now. No, I said. What happens to me, he said. I looked at him. 3 years ago, he had watched me walk out of our father's study and said nothing. He had taken my posting. He had let me carry 4 years of exile on a coast that the commission was deliberately starving. He had come here to offer me a restoration on terms that would have buried the evidence and protected Harvin and left everything exactly as it was. And now he was sitting in the room where the evidence had been found, asking what happened to him. The investigation will cover the grain shipment, I said. The 11-day sequence between the audit and my exile is in the record. Your connection to Harvin is in the record. I paused. Whether the investigation finds grounds to name you formally depends on what else they find in the commission's records. And if it does, then you'll be called to answer it, I said. Through the correct channels, in the correct procedural format. He looked at me for a long moment. You're not going to protect me, he said. Not accusatory. Just recognizing something he had perhaps half expected. No, I said. Father will... Father's name is in the secondary documentation as having been present when the original misrouting was approved, I said. Not as a principal, as someone who was aware. That's a different level of exposure. The investigation will determine the degree. End quote. I looked at him. I didn't put it in the discrepancy report. It's in the supplementary record at the audit office. If the investigation warrants it, they'll find it themselves. Dorian looked at the table. You thought of everything, he said. I thought of the things that needed thinking about, I said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. I was better at the charm, he said finally. You were always better at the counting. Yes, I said, and the counting is what this coast needed. I stood up. The reassignment order is voided by the tribunal finding, I said. You're free to go. I'd recommend going before the investigation reaches the stage where travel is restricted. I paused at the door. I'm not helping you, and I'm not stopping you. What you do with that is your decision. He looked up at me. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something in his face that was not charm and not calculation. Something older and simpler, the expression of a younger version of my brother, who had not yet learned that charm was a more reliable tool than honesty, and who had made the decision, at some point I could not identify, to become the person he had become. I did not feel sorry for him. But I understood him, in the way you understand something that had other possibilities and chose none of them. Kael, he said. Goodbye, Dorian, I said. I walked out. He was gone by morning. I found out when Roven did the head count at dawn and reported it without comment. I noted it in the zone log. Civilian oversight appointment departed following voiding of reassignment order and moved on to the morning numbers. Salt production, 17 pounds. Fish catch, first pull, 22. Preserved stock inventory, 2,140 pounds, adjusted for the day's consumption. Personnel, 243. Stable. The compass was on the table in front of me while I wrote. I hadn't taken it out deliberately. It had come out of my coat at some point during the previous evening, and I hadn't put it back. I looked at it. The needle was still. Not the stillness of a decision pending, a different kind. The stillness of a direction already found and followed. The stillness of a thing that has done what it was for and is now simply present. I picked it up. Thought about my grandfather, who had carried it through the siege of Aldenmore and had given it to me at 14 and had said, "This compass doesn't point north, Kael. It points at the right decision, but only after you've already found it yourself." I had found a lot of right decisions on this coast. Salt over fish, surplus over subsistence, record over accusation, report over grievance, the gift of 40 barrels, the field documentation provision, Silas's 18-month-old inquiry, holding pages 11 through 14 until Torval committed to the provenance challenge. The compass had confirmed 4 of them, the rest I had figured out myself, and the compass had stayed still, and that had been fine. The compass was not a shortcut, it was a receipt. You did the work. The needle confirmed it. If it stayed still, you did more work. That was all it was. That was enough. I put it back in my coat. The Emperor arrived on a Tuesday. No formal announcement, or rather, an announcement that arrived only slightly ahead of the party itself, which was either a statement about imperial confidence in rapid preparation, or a statement about the Emperor's interest in seeing the coast as it actually was, rather than as it would be, once someone had time to arrange it. I suspected the latter. He came with a small escort, 40 imperial guards, 2 court officials, a personal secretary. Not a state visit, an inspection visit. The kind a man makes when he has received a tribunal finding and a commission investigation referral and a provisioning gift of 40 barrels from a coast that his commissioner had classified as non-producing and wants to understand the discrepancy between what the record said and what is apparently true. I met him at the station gate. He was younger than I expected, 40 perhaps, a year or 2 older than I would have guessed from the court paintings. He had the quality of attention that very few people develop and almost none maintain, which was the ability to look at something and actually see it rather than seeing the category it belongs to. He looked at the station, at the smokehouse columns, at the salt pans on the northern shelf, at the fishing boats completing the morning's second pull, at the 243 people moving through the organized rotation of a coast that had decided to survive and had found the means to do it. He looked at all of it. Then he looked at me. "Kael Donridge," he said. "Your Majesty," I said. He extended his hand. Not the formal gesture, not the back-of-the-hand presentation that required a bow and a specific approach angle and the correct depth of obeisance. He extended his hand the way one man extends his hand to another when he wants to make contact rather than establish hierarchy. I shook it. I did not bow first. He noticed. The slight shift in his expression, not offense, something closer to confirmation, as though he had expected this and was glad to find it accurate. "Show me," he said. I showed him everything. The smokehouse, both of them, the original and Marin's edition. He asked about the wood choice. I explained the driftwood versus cliff timber difference, and he asked a follow-up question about the smoke temperature that indicated he had either studied preservation methods personally or had been briefed in detail before arriving, and I found I couldn't determine which, and it didn't matter. The salt pans, Marin walked him through the evaporation system, the tide channel engineering, the yield calculations. He asked her 3 questions. She answered all 3 without deferring to me, which was correct, because I had not built the salt pans. She had. The harbor, the 3 boats, the rotation system, the net repair protocols, the dawn feeding window. Perrin explained the shadow watching technique with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had invented a skill through necessity and was pleased to demonstrate it. The Emperor watched him demonstrate it for longer than protocol probably suggested he should. The records room, the continuity ledger, the batch logs, the 12 years of harbor master documentation, the inventory system. The court official accompanying us had been writing steadily since we entered the station. At the records room, he ran out of space on his first document and needed a second. Tosker showed him the community, the 230 people from the inland farming settlement who had arrived on day 7 with nothing and were now integrated into a functioning coastal economy. The Emperor asked Tosker directly how long the walk from the inland settlement had taken. 3 days, Tosker said. The Emperor looked at the coast, then back at Tosker, then asked a question I couldn't hear. Tosker answered it. The Emperor nodded slowly. I watched this and thought about the 40 barrels, about the chain they had started. Surplus shipment to capital. Capital routes to Harvin for response. Harvin responds with suspension order. Suspension order becomes evidence. Evidence builds case. Case goes to tribunal. Tribunal refers to investigation. Investigation produces finding. Finding reaches the Emperor. Emperor arrives on a Tuesday on a coast that was supposed to have quietly disappeared. 40 barrels of fish. From 9 days of rations and a cliff. At the end of the inspection, the Emperor and I stood at the edge of the cliff. The same cliff I had stood at on the first day, looking at the same ocean, hearing the same wind. The difference was the smoke behind us, the boats below, the sound of 243 people going about the work of a coast that had decided to exist. The tribunal finding referred Harvin's case to the Review Commission, the Emperor said. Yes, I said. The Review Commission's preliminary finding is that the discrepancy report is accurate in full, he said. 47 instances across 4 years. The investigation is expanding to cover additional zones. He paused. It appears the Famine Coast was not the only zone under similar management. I had suspected this, but had not included it in the report. Speculation without documentation was not evidence, and I had learned to work with evidence. How many zones? I said. 7, currently identified, he said. Possibly more. 7 zones, 4 years each. The same pattern, replicated. This was why the implementation records hadn't existed, not because Harvin had been careless about covering one coast. Because covering 7 coasts had required a systematic approach, and systematic approaches leave systematic evidence, and systematic evidence was exactly what I had been trained to find. The commissioner's post will be dissolved and restructured, the Emperor said. The Western Supply Division will be placed under direct audit office oversight during the restructuring period. He looked at the ocean. I need someone to lead the restructuring. I looked at him. The restructuring, I said carefully, of the entire Western Supply Division. The person I need, he said, understands supply chains from the inside, knows where the systematic failures occur, has demonstrated the ability to rebuild a producing operation from nothing, and document the process accurately enough that it can be replicated. He paused. And has demonstrated, in a formal tribunal setting, the ability to navigate imperial bureaucracy without being absorbed by it. I looked at the ocean. Below us, one of the fishing boats was coming in. Second pull of the morning, based on the timing. From the cliff I could see the catch moving in the net. Good pull. 60 fish at least. 243 people. A second smokehouse. 17 pounds of salt per day. A coast that had been classified as non-producing and had decided, on 9 days of rations and a surveyor's report and a compass that confirmed right decisions after you'd already found them, to prove the classification wrong. The Famine Coast needs a permanent administrator, I said. Someone with operational authority, commercial relationships, and the continuity ledger already in their hands. Yes, the Emperor said. Marin, I said. Sergeant Marin, currently production chief. She built the second smokehouse when I was at the tribunal. She managed the civilian oversight challenge correctly. She has the ledger. Done, he said. The appointment will be formalized through the audit office. I nodded. And the post you're offering me, I said. It operates independently of the commissioner's office successor. It operates independently of the commissioner's office entirely, he said. Direct to the audit office. Commissioner oversight was the mechanism of the problem. It won't be the mechanism of the solution. I looked at the cliff edge. At the 200-foot drop to black water. 3 months ago, I had stood here with 12 men and 9 days of rations and a compass that wasn't moving yet. The compass in my coat pocket was still. It had nothing to confirm. The decision was already made. Had been made, if I was honest, The moment I understood what the restructuring covered and what it meant that 7 zones had been running the same pattern and what the difference was between fixing one coast and fixing the system that had broken all of them. One coast was survival. 7 zones was the reason survival had been necessary. I turned to the Emperor. He was watching me with the quality of attention I'd noticed when he arrived, seeing rather than categorizing. "Yes," I said. He extended his hand again. I shook it again. Neither of us bowed. I left the coast on a Thursday. The morning before I left, I stood in the records room and went through the continuity ledger one last time. Not checking it, just reading it. The way you read something that has been important and that you are handing to someone else and want to hold for one more moment before it belongs to the next pair of hands. Day 1, 13 men, 9 days of rations, 6 boats, 1 net. Day 5, salt pans operational, 17 pounds per day. Day 7, 230 refugees, 243 total. Day 9, smokehouse operational, first full cure cycle complete. Day 19, merchant contact, 50 pounds sold, trading relationship established. Day 40, Harvin's suspension order received. Day 51, Dorian's arrival, reassignment order presented and rejected. Day 55, departed for capital. Day 69, returned. Tribunal finding upheld in full. And beyond that, in Marin's handwriting, the days I had been away. Production numbers, inventory adjustments, the second smokehouse construction, the third boat's first run, the salt pan extension. The coast had not paused. It had never needed to pause. That was the thing I understood standing in the records room on the morning I left. The best version of what I had built here was the version that didn't need me to keep building it. The compass confirmed right decisions, but right decisions, once made and embedded in a system, kept producing right outcomes without a compass in the room. Marin came in while I was standing there. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at the ledger in my hands. "I know the numbers," she said. "I know you do," I said. I set it down on the table, her table now. "The salt pan yield. You said 15 when I left, 17 now. If the northern extension keeps performing, you might hit 20 by next season." 19, she said. "The rock formation has a limit. I've mapped it." Of course she had. 19, I said. I walked to the door. "Kael," she said. I stopped. She had never called me by name before, always sir, always the correct address. I turned around. "The report nobody read," she said. "The coastal survey from 3 years ago." She paused. "Is there one for the other zones, the ones the investigation is expanding to cover?" I looked at her. "Some of them," I said. "Filed, stamped, archived." "Then someone should read them," she said. "Someone will," I said. "That's the job now." She nodded once. I walked out. Roven was waiting with the horses. Colt was already mounted, looking at the coast with the expression of someone who has been somewhere long enough that leaving it requires a specific internal adjustment. I mounted. We rode up toward the ridge. At the top, I stopped again, the same place I'd stopped on the way back from the capital, looking down at what 3 months had built, the smoke from 2 smokehouses now, 3 boats on the water, the salt pans catching the morning light, the organized movement of 243 people on a coast that had been classified as non-producing. Marin was visible at the station gate, a small figure from the ridge, but I knew the posture, watching us go with the focused attention of someone who has already moved on to the next problem and is simply waiting for us to be over the ridge so she can go back to it. I raised a hand. She raised one back. I turned the horse east. Behind me, the Famine Coast continued. The boats pulled. The salt pans evaporated. The smokehouses cured. The ledger updated. 243 people who had been sent here or come here or ended up here by the various mechanisms that send people to places they didn't plan to be, living on a coast that had decided to exist and had found the means to keep existing whether or not anyone in a capital city had the correct classification on record. The compass was in my coat pocket. Still. Not the stillness of waiting. The stillness of a thing that has said what it needed to say and is content to rest until the next decision forms, and the work of finding the right answer begins again. It had confirmed 4 decisions. Salt over fish, surplus as currency, the gift of 40 barrels, east toward the capital. 4 confirmations. 4 right decisions earned through the work of finding them. The rest had been mine. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. You figured out the answer. The needle confirmed it. And if it stayed still, you thought harder. I rode east. 7 zones, each with a filed survey that nobody had read, each with a systematic pattern of misallocation that had been running long enough to leave evidence in its own records, each with people living on them or near them who had been shaped by years of deliberate neglect into the particular kind of resilience that neglect produces, the kind that knows how to survive with less because it has never been given more. 7 zones. And a post that operated directly under the audit office, independent of the commissioner's structure, with a mandate to find the pattern and document it and present it through the correct procedural channels, in the correct format, to the correct authority. A report. Not an accusation. A report. I knew how to write those. I'd written one that nobody had read 3 years ago, and it had turned out to be the most important thing I'd ever done, not because anyone had read it, but because no one had, which meant every observation in it was still accurate and completely unknown to anyone who might use it against me when I arrived on the coast with 9 days of rations and 12 men and a compass that was waiting for me to think hard enough. The right information in the right place at the right time. That was supply logistics. That was everything. The cliff road curved east and the ocean disappeared behind the ridgeline, and ahead of me was the river highway and the capital, and 7 zones, and the work of fixing a system that had been broken long enough that the breaking felt like how it was supposed to be. It wasn't how it was supposed to be. I knew what surplus looked like. I had built it from nothing, on a coast where nothing was supposed to grow. I would find it in 6 more places. And when the Emperor's Court received the findings, clean numbers, organized by zone, cross-referenced against the official delivery logs, submitted through the correct channels in the correct procedural format, they would not be able to say they hadn't been told. They would have the report. They would have to read it.